Chapter 833. In the underground meeting room of the president's residence, the heated argument was still going on. The National Security Advisor slammed the table angrily and yelled at the Bureau of Proclamation official in front of him. There are only 4 targets in total, and we have to send out 3 warships, and hundreds of Inferno missiles are going to be fired at them? Who the F***CK came up with this plan? Is there something wrong with the charter computer? Sir, those aren't normal targets. The current situation is that even if the Bureau of Proclamation activates the program to open the electronic fence by the time the special forces arrive, those 4 people will have already escaped. The most important thing is that none of us are confident that we can capture these people with our ground forces. The Deputy Minister of Defense retorted with a gloomy face. Hundreds of Inferno missiles and warships do seem exaggerated, but we really need such powerful firepower. If the charter computer didn't make a mistake, other than Sulu, the Empire's princess, and the Empire's great teacher, the other person is the mechanic Euphone. 6 years ago, when the 4 military regions carried out the last assassination mission, they sent out mecha teams and warships, but they still let him escape. Sir, I hope you won't forget this point. Sitting at the end of the long table, General Lee Jae-do had been silent the whole time. He looked at the operation plan in front of him thoughtfully. His digital pen lightly moved, and no one knew what he was thinking. The old man who appeared in the middle of the wetland was his uncle, the person he was most wary of after that night of coffin support. He had hoped countless times that this person wouldn't appear, but in the end, that person still came. As a member of the Federation, of course I know the importance of those 4 targets, but I have to remind you of one thing. The National Security Advisor pointed at the electronic map on the screen and roared. The protected area is close to the back of Macho Mountain. The target location is less than 7 kilometers away from the manor. That is the Tai family area recognized by the government. What do the missiles and warships mean? Could it be that they want to declare war on Lady Tai? Or is the government ready to declare war on all 7 families? He took out a handkerchief and wiped the sweat on his forehead. Coldly looking around, he said in a hoarse voice, "You're only thinking about the war between the Federation and the Imperium, but I am more worried about whether the Federation will officially enter a civil war because of this attack." There was silence in the conference room. The generals and officials knew very well that what the security advisor was worried about was very frightening. However, the Federation would not allow such a situation to happen if they did not launch an attack, while the Empire's princess was right in front of them. Lee Jae-do, who had been silent all this while, suddenly spoke. "Launch a warship attack." The Deputy Minister of Defense beside him frowned and said, "The main cannon of the warship is an instant attack. Logically speaking, there should be no problem. However, mechanic Euphone can't use conventional logic. Without missiles to increase the coverage, the attack is very likely to fail." At this moment, the heavy alloy door of the conference room slid open smoothly, and President Pabre, who had forcibly interrupted an important trip, hurried in. He waved his hand to stop everyone from standing up and saluting, and said in a deep and powerful voice, "Execute the plan according to the central computer." The generals and officials in the conference room were slightly stunned. Their expressions were all different, and they immediately began to implement the battle plan. The president placed his hands on the table and silently looked at the light screen above his head. His expression was abnormally solemn. The Madam of the Back Mountain had just made a decision that shook him. She had opened up the Crystal Mining Consortium. In the face of such a concession, the government had to make a corresponding response. The Parliament Hill needed a very long time to review the matter. However, could the government's response be the attack of the warships, main cannon, and countless missiles? In terms of political stability, the president should have chosen a more reliable method, but he did not. He directly and forcefully issued the order to attack, because in the center of that wetland were 2 important figures of the Empire, the most wanted criminal of the Federation, and more importantly, Sulu was there. President Pabre looked at Lee Jae-do and said expressionlessly, "I will immediately call Lady Tai to avoid causing her to make a wrong judgment." "That madam will not make a wrong judgment." The troublesome thing is that she is very willing to make a wrong judgment and then seek the relevant benefits, Lee Jae-do calmly replied. Some people can use the overall benefits of the Federation to bargain, but we cannot. The president looked at the satellite image on the light screen and looked at the ground that was faintly discernible in the fog. He said indifferently, "We must be responsible for the Federation." In the center of the wetland, the winter tree gradually became more and more blurred behind the several figures. Mechanical calculation is never a real thought process. The seemingly omnipotent central computer of the Federation is actually not that scary. No matter how powerful the tool is, it is just a broken tool in the hands of the stupid and indecisive human. Uncle Feng Yu reached out and took the box of brand 37 cigarettes from Su Lu, who was pushing the cart. He took out a cigarette and lit it. He walked slowly and talked slowly, completely ignoring the countdown and the possibility of the imminent terrorist attack. His disdainful and indifferent expression was incomparably powerful and vigorous. There is a theory that the key point of the official origin of human beings before the catastrophe was learning how to use tools. In my opinion, it is very regretful or shameful that human beings have not evolved a bit since then, especially the way they use tools is still so clumsy. Feng Yu glanced at the broken light screen of the broken computer on the broken cart and shrugged. Even if the central computer has protected the core data, it is meaningless. It has to wait for someone to give the order. But people have to think, if they throw a bomb here, what will the old woman behind the mountain in front think? I didn't choose this place blindly. On the other side of the broken cart, Huai Chaosher suddenly frowned and asked, "You chose this place?" "Of course." Feng Yu proudly lifted the black hair in front of his forehead, revealing his true colors below. "The data in your intelligence department were all left by me. Otherwise, which agent of the Imperium do you think could have chosen such a good place for you?" Su Li's expression changed slightly, and he lowered his head and continued to push the cart in silence. Although he had roared angrily about the miserable life of child labor earlier, some things had been deeply rooted in his bones, such as working as a coolie for the uncle, and such as standing on the Federation's side habitually and thinking as a person of the Federation, especially a soldier of the Federation. "Can your expression not be so stiff?" Feng Yu looked at him mockingly. "You're not a person of the Federation. I am. Besides, other than your crazy and perverted sister, who do you think can use this data?" At this moment, a low humming sound came from the sky far away, as if several grand pianos were playing at the same time in an empty room. Sula narrowed his eyes, but he did not turn around. He knew that countless missiles were tearing apart the fog and flying toward the winter tree behind him. Feng Yu and Huai Chaosher, who were walking on the two sides of the broken cart, were indifferent and did not turn around. But Great Teacher, who was walking at the front, looked back, only to discover that the morning fog where everybody had been had strangely disappeared. The wetland was clear and bright, and the winter tree had disappeared at some point. Where it had been standing stubbornly before, a few soundless black holes could be vaguely seen. 300 Ardent Fire 2 missiles were launched, and countless explosions rang out one after another, as if the deepest drum of an orchestra was beating the ground. The wetland began to tremble. The frost-white grass, the gradually solidifying ice, and the remaining branches were dismembered by the cheers of the high-energy explosives. The debris that they turned into at the cost of their lives drifted in the air. Before they could fall, they began to burn fiercely again, turning into a real fire that covered several kilometers. At the edge of the raging fire, there were 4 people who seemed to be leaving slowly, but were actually leaving quickly. They were not riding horses nor carrying sticks. They were just pushing a small cart. They were not afraid or flustered. Even the burning wilderness behind them could not make them stay silent for a while. The uncle leaned against the broken cart lazily with a cigarette between his lips, blowing a cheerful whistle that was not sad at all, as if he were playing the accompaniment for the terrifying explosion behind him. Walking to a nameless puddle, Sula looked at the uncle next to the cart and could not help but remark, "Uncle, I have to admit that your narcissism is very reasonable. You are indeed vigorous." This is vigorous? When I was vigorous, I was much more vigorous than this. Pure seafood. Yu looked at him and said mockingly, to deal with that broken computer, it is not enough to understand it. The more important thing is to understand those who use it. What are those government officials and generals thinking in their heads? What are they hesitating about, and what can we use in between? Tools were used by humans. To fight against a powerful tool was, in fact, to fight against the people who used it. This seemed to be a very simple principle, but Sulu knew very well how difficult it was to use this method to find the gaps between those lights, because the complexity of the human thought pattern was even more complex than that of the charter computer. This is not difficult. Yu looked at him and said indifferently, when you turn this judgment into some kind of vague instinct like me, there won't be any problems. But since you insist on not getting on my boat, when you're chased by that broken computer in the future, don't cry and ask me to be your uncle. Sulu listened silently and seriously. Then he smiled, knowing that the uncle had taught him the most important lesson today. Then his smile gradually faded, knowing that it was time to say goodbye after they had just reunited. What made him a little confused and at a loss was that this separation was the result of his own persistence, and he could not even clearly explain why he was so insistent. Yu removed the cigarette from between his lips and raised his head to look at the steep cliff not far away. His usually arrogant and indifferent face that was full of vicissitudes of life suddenly showed a rare trace of emotion. The old man said that he had already entered this gamble and would definitely win. It probably means that he has seen through you. You little guy are a stinking rock, and you won't give up until you are smashed into pieces. Yu said thoughtfully, you are all the same kind of people, always liking to gamble with your lives. But in my opinion, life should not be wasted like this. If you care too much about something, you'll be dragged into the abyss by those things, and it will be difficult to rise again. He raised his head and looked at the clear blue sky that was gradually revealing its true appearance. He said mockingly, just like this crappy computer of yours. More than 10 billion dogs are chained to the Federation, but in the end, you have become a dog for more than 10 billion people. Oh. Chapter 834. Anything that you care about can be a dog chain. Yes, including hometown, lover, hot-bloodedness, honor, comrades? Yes. Sulu looked at the white cliff reflected in the shallow pool in front of him. After a moment of silence, he raised his head and looked at Yu with a smile. I also don't want to be tied by a dog chain, even if it's related by blood or something like that. So, I have to break free with force and then walk my own path. Yu looked at him calmly. Even if it means death? Even if it means death. Sulu turned around and looked at Huai Caoshi's messy and slightly dirty purple hair. He looked at her ordinary face and looked at her small eyes. Sorry, I'm very grateful for you coming, but I really can't leave with you. After saying this, he hesitated for a moment and then opened his arms somewhat stiffly. Huai Caoshi's expression froze slightly. She opened her arms like him, right arm slightly up, left arm slightly down, and slowly and hesitantly took a step forward. The two of them crossed their arms somewhat awkwardly. Their upper bodies leaned forward and gently hugged like two pieces of wood. Then they separated. Can you promise me one thing? Sulu looked in her eyes and said softly. Huai Caoshi looked at him quietly. Sulu hesitated again and said with some difficulty, the thing you took from Zhou is too big of a threat to the Federation. After we return to the Empire, can I trouble you to destroy it? Huai Caoshi's eyes gradually narrowed. There was some coldness and faint disappointment in her eyes. Sulu knew that there was no way for him to not be angry when he said something like this at this moment. He lowered his head and said, if that thing falls into your hands and is cracked, too many people in the federal forces on the front lines will die. Although probably no one thinks so right now. Some of them are my subordinates and comrades after all. Then, have you ever thought about how many fewer Imperial soldiers would die if that little blue device was cracked? And they are your real compatriots? Huai Caoshi narrowed his eyes and slowly clenched his fists. After a while, he slowly released them and said with a trace of tiredness that was difficult to suppress, I promise you. Thank you, Sulu said. I know you're disappointed. I'm sorry. Huai Chaosher looked at him coldly and said, I know what kind of person you are, so my real disappointment is that since you don't want to go home with me, your last words before leaving are actually this. That wasn't the last sentence. Sula looked at her and paused for a very long time. Then he said, I will go to the Empire to see your sister. Hearing these two words, Huai Caosher's narrowed eyes slowly relaxed. The lines and expression on her face that seemed to be carved from steel suddenly melted into the branches of spring. She reached out and patted Su Li's shoulder. Without saying anything, she turned around and left. Crossing the river of stars to come to the Federation, disregarding the risk of life and death, even throwing the Empire and all of her responsibilities to the back of her mind, this most powerful princess just wanted to bring her younger brother home. Even though her wish was not fulfilled, she was already satisfied to hear the last two words. The wilderness was full of the pungent smell of residual fire and ammunition. The frosty grass by the wetland was completely withered and charred. The three people walked into the smoke. They could faintly hear some very unnutritious dialogue. They could vaguely imagine what kind of story would happen in the long journey that followed. I didn't expect that I would have to be a nanny for once when I'm old. This was the uncle's arrogant and infuriating sigh. Nasri, I definitely don't mind beating you until you can't take care of yourself. This was Huai Caosher's calm and confident threat. Yes, I'm very willing to be his nanny in this situation. This was the direct expression of a master. Seeing those figures disappear into the wildfire and wild grass, Su Lu slowly retracted his gaze. He tidied up his equipment and silently left to the other side, his face expressionless. He could not go back to the Empire with Huai Caosher. He had killed too many people from the Empire. Macklin was his uncle, and that Butcher Keaton should also be some kind of relative. In this kind of situation, he did not know how to face that strange country. This was not the key to the matter. He believed that Her Majesty had enough methods and iron blood to suppress all voices of dissent. The real key was that he had been to the Empire before. He did not like the Empire. Compared to the Dark Federation, the human world of the Left Heaven Star region was even more naked and dark. He could not imagine that he would live a peaceful life in that kind of hierarchical society and enjoy the blood and sustenance of hundreds of millions of lowly people. He could not imagine that he would one day lead the Imperial Royal Army to fight against the Federation. He could not imagine that one day he might run into the 17th Division. He lay Xiong Linquan, Hua Xiaoxi, Gu Shifeng, and the others on the battlefield, but he had to raise the gun in his hand, wander together with the uncle. A slightly cold pain appeared in the depths of Su Li's eyes. The uncle had just said that the mine disaster that killed his parents in Xi'an was caused by the previous generation of seeds of the Empire. But other than him, even the Imperial royal family did not know where he was. So how could that seed of the Empire know? He walked alone in the wetlands and entered the short shrubs at the foot of the mountain. He did not pay attention to the fighter jets whistling through the sky. His heart was heavy and frustrated. He could not go to the Empire, and he could not stay in the Federation. The universe was so big, so where should he go? At the edge of the new moonlight and shadow, a quiet and broken tri-winged spaceship floated in the dark space. Inside this spaceship that looked down on human society like a ghost, an angry and resentful voice echoed. This electronic voice was perfectly simulated to have a hoarse and slightly hoarse texture. It definitely did not have a cold feeling, but was rather charming. Core program protection? You clearly did not know of my existence. So why did you make the core program protection? Is it because of that stinky uncle with a mouth full of rotten teeth that Su Lu spoke of? Or did you intuitively discover my intentions? Beep beep. You actually managed to deceive this young master. This old lady will fight it out with you. Green streams of data flashed quickly on the narrow workbench's hologram. Student Philip had discovered the abnormality of the Federal Central Computer. He was so ashamed that he became angry and cursed nonstop, as if someone was jumping around with their hands on their hips. Since he had discovered the problem, Philip immediately began to work. Although he could not see the light of breaking through the core protection of his own body in a short time, through the ubiquitous electronic monitoring network, he immediately discovered the source of the problem. The hologram on the hologram quickly zoomed in, showing a wetland that still had a faint trace of smoke remaining. "My little master, where are you hiding?" Philip used a very short time to scan the wetland and confirmed that Su Lu was not dead and had left. He could not help but grumble in disappointment. During this period of time, the tri-winged battleship floating in the sky above New Moon was mainly carrying out two tasks. The first was to compete with the Bureau of Proclamation's main body for the leadership of the Federation of Light. Although the central computer did not discover the existence of this fellow and did not do anything, it still firmly held the leadership. However, the embarrassed and angry Philip insisted that this was a very difficult battle, and that he had only lost because he did not have enough resources. The second task was to search for Su Li's whereabouts. However, the Federal Central Computer could not find Su Lu, and naturally, the tri-wing battleship could not find him either. Philip quietly hacked into the monitoring network and began to continuously monitor 50 important locations. These monitoring points were all locations in his memory that had a special meaning to Su Lu. Linhai State's Li Hua University, including the library, the H1 area, the Iron Gate, and the female dormitory. Linhai State's gymnasium, especially the underground parking lot. Shell Motor Company's headquarters, especially the Research Institute, as well as the Whitewater Security Company, the Ministry of Defense building, the training base, and the Wangdu Youth Residence. The voice in the tri-wing battleship suddenly quieted down, and a tea house on the street next to the Wangdu Youth Residence appeared on the screen. Outside the tea house was a little girl wearing a pink sweater and carrying a heavy school bag. She looks very familiar. The streets of the capital in winter seemed particularly bleak. The annoying wind passed through the apartment buildings, cutting the faces of pedestrians like knives and the bodies of trees before smashing themselves into ice shards under the walls or windows. Zhong Huiyin stood outside the floor-to-ceiling glass window of a tea house. She exhaled a mouthful of white fog, brushed off the ice on her mask, and put it back on. Her two eyes, which were exposed outside the large mask, looked around attentively at the youth residents opposite her, not caring about the frost hanging on her slender eyelashes. The sweater was very thick, and the earmuffs were very warm. The little girl was not very afraid of the cold, but the backpack on her back was too heavy. Her feet were a little stiff, and she couldn't help but stamp her feet. She thought silently in her heart, "I've already searched the Shishan courtyard and Charter Square. Could it be that I really have to go to Linhai State?" She wasn't afraid of the long journey, but she was worried that in the process of searching, she would miss that guy again. Inside the floor-to-ceiling glass window, the owner of the tea house, who was also a waiter, kept looking at the little girl outside the window curiously. Doing business on the street, the owner didn't know how many strange situations he had seen over the years, but in such a cold winter, a little girl who was fully equipped to resist the cold actually stood on the street for half a day. It was really rare. What kind of perseverance did this require? He couldn't help but think of the beautiful woman who cut her cheek in the tea house that year. His heart slightly moved. He knocked on a glass and smiled to indicate that the little girl could come in to warm herself. Zhong Huiyin heard the knocking behind her and curiously looked back. After understanding the other party's meaning, she shook her head to indicate that she didn't need to. Although the big mask covered 2/3 of her face, her eyes narrowed like the moon, clearly showing the sweet smile of gratitude. A man wearing a woolen coat walked out of the restaurant next door. The man was obviously drunk, and the words he muttered indicated that he should be a government official. Just as his subordinate went to get the car, the man noticed Zhong Huiyin standing on the street side of the tea house. He saw her beautiful and clean eyes and didn't know why his heart moved. He staggered over and put his arm around the little girl's shoulder. He laughed and said, "Little girl, where are your parents?" The door of the tea house was pushed open, and the owner ran out. He pointed at him and shouted, "What are you doing?" Although through the mask, the stench of alcohol could still be smelled. Zhong Huiyin frowned in disgust. She felt that the hands that were holding her shoulders were getting tighter and tighter. She finally couldn't help but put her right hand into her pocket. Chapter 835. The drunk official squinted at the owner of the tea house. His arms were still around Zhong Huiyan. He belched and shouted angrily, "What's with your attitude? Do you know who I am?" Because of this arrogant attitude, the owner of the tea house was slightly shocked. His courage to rush out suddenly decreased by more than half. But looking at the little girl who was forcibly held in the arms of the official, he still whispered a few words of advice. He knew that on this street, no matter how drunk the official was, he would not dare to do anything outrageous. At most, he would take advantage of her. Although it was perverted, the little girl should not be in any danger. Some people came out of the street next to them and looked at this scene curiously. The official's face was a little embarrassed, as if he had been greatly insulted. He kept shouting and waving his arms excitedly, almost hitting Zhong Huiyan's cheek. In the quarrel, things like asking for the direction of the toilet and the government's special investigator being on the same level as them were not qualified to enter Zhong Huiyan's ears. She patted the drunk official's chest and abdomen and suddenly smiled. Her eyes outside the mask narrowed into a new moon. She said sweetly, "Uncle, you're hurting me." The little girl's voice was very clear and soft. The drunk official laughed foolishly and let go of his hand. He tried to reach out and pat her little face frivolously and said vaguely, "Good girl, really ah." A scream came out of the official's mouth, which instantly covered the sizzling sound of the electric arc. He, who was attacked by the electric current, painfully covered his lower abdomen. His drunkenness suddenly disappeared, and he stared at the innocent little girl in front of him in disbelief. He twitched and fell to the cold concrete ground. There was suddenly a burst of exclamations in the crowd. The smile on Zhong Huiyan's face gradually disappeared. She looked at the official who was rolling at her feet expressionlessly. Without hesitation, she pressed the button of the taser in her hand again. The blue electric arc tore through the dry air and hit the man's lower abdomen accurately again. The cloth between his legs was burned black. This time, the crowd did not exclaim. Instead, they all gasped in unison, especially those middle-aged men. They subconsciously tilted their buttocks backwards, as if the terrifying electric arc could hit their vital parts at any time. Their posture was extremely comical. The things made by Su Lu are really useful. Zhong Huiyan shrugged and put the stun baton back into her pocket. Then, she looked at the surrounding crowd and said coldly, "Any uncle who has evil thoughts about a little girl should end up like this." Then she turned her head and smiled sweetly at the owner of the tea house, saying, "You're a good uncle. Do you want to treat me to some hot tea?" The ambulance came and left. Perhaps it was too embarrassing, but the official did not call the police. The crowd gradually dispersed. Zhong Huiyan's feet were a little stiff from the cold. She was quite tired from the days of searching and waiting, so she went straight into the tea house behind her and asked for a cup of hot tea and a plate of snacks. "If you have any trouble in the future, just call the number on the card and tell her that the card is from me." Zhong Huiyan took a sip of the slightly hot flower tea and sighed contentedly. She stuck out the tip of her tongue and handed the card to the confused owner. She smiled and said, "Don't worry. From today onwards, except for a few people, no one in the Federation will dare to provoke you." The owner of the tea house looked at the name Nan Xiangmei on the card and the signature of a second-level teacher training foundation. He couldn't help but smile bitterly. He thought to himself, what can a female teacher do? What childish little girl. She probably thinks that teachers are the most terrible existence in the world. Zhong Huiyan did not pay attention to the owner's complex psychological activities. Her eyes were attracted by the news on the screen. The news channel of the Federation was reporting on a meteorite impact that happened in the suburbs of the capital today. According to the news report, this meteorite impact was quite rare. The earthquake waves caused by it could even be seen as far away as Nank. Fortunately, it happened in the center of the wildlife reserve, otherwise it would have caused a lot of casualties. As for the meteorite impact, S1, the Federal Academy of Science had already calculated the relevant trajectory 3 years ago. However, in order to not cause unnecessary psychological panic, it had not been made public. At this time, The news on the screen suddenly changed to another picture. The picture was of a group of buildings in the capital. It should have been filmed by the TV station's helicopter. In the center of the picture, a blurred figure was crossing the buildings at an incredible speed. Neither the high walls nor the surrounding police cars could slow down his speed. Zhong Huiyan's pupil shrank. She suddenly stood up. The teacup and snack plate in front of her fell to the ground. She did not react at all. She just stared at the TV screen and the figure running at high speed. The TV screen remained silent for a long time. In the silent picture, the figure sometimes ran like lightning through the narrow alleys. Sometimes it was like a cheetah crossing the long streets. Sometimes it was like an antelope jumping on the eaves of the low houses. Sometimes it was like an ape climbing on the steep and slippery surface of the buildings. With an ability that humans could not imagine, it crossed all obstacles. He sometimes appeared and sometimes disappeared. However, he was unable to get rid of the increasing number of hunting teams and the countless flying objects in the sky. Then, the powerful voiceover of the famous female announcer finally appeared on the news screen. The Empire's spy, Sulu, has once again appeared unscrupulously. This is the most naked challenge to the dignity of the Federation. Citizens, at this moment, the Federation needs you. Today, we are all warriors. Fight your mother. Zhong Huiyan clenched her fist and muttered softly in a daze. Fengyu was right. The ability of the Federal Central Computer was more terrifying than Su Lu had imagined. After climbing over the electronic wall and returning to the city, in just a few hours, he had encountered several of the most dangerous encounters in his life. Once the omnipresent, the glory of the charter was fully activated, it was actually so terrifying. In the city, inside and outside the buildings, there were no loopholes. The whistling bullets and the whistling sound of the helicopter above his head were like countless invisible and hard ropes that were slowly and unstoppably tightening. In the next moment, they were going to choke his throat and suffocate him to death. Facing the whistling cold wind, Sulu madly ran up and down the buildings. His chest rapidly and exaggeratedly moved up and down. He inhaled oxygen at the highest efficiency and converted it into much-needed energy. He keenly heard the sirens from all directions. He had no time to pay attention to the Federation News Channel's helicopter above his head. After falling into a desperate situation again, he should have felt regret. For example, he chose to stay instead of leaving with the uncle. However, no one knew that at this moment, his mood was actually so calm. Many people wanted him to die, and some people wanted him to leave. However, after knowing the story of his past, he was frustrated and lonely. He needed warmth. He wanted to find his own place, so he didn't want to leave the Federation. He didn't want to leave the city that he was once so familiar with but now so unfamiliar with. From a psychological analysis, this was probably a hidden, self-destructive tendency at work. Sulu faintly felt this destructive emotion, but he didn't care, because no matter how big the world was, it was not as important as his mood. He just didn't want to have Astra's king leave, die, or commit suicide. What's wrong with him? When one was on the verge of despair, it was the easiest to stimulate one's potential. Su Li's brain worked faster than ever as he ran. His fingers dug into the hard concrete wall, propelling his body to draw an arc in the air. While he swept past the police cars on the street, he had already determined where he was going to run to next. According to the last lesson taught by the uncle, Su Lu was no longer trying to figure out how to avoid the scanning of the charter computer. Instead, he was constantly calculating the ratio of firepower of the federal forces. Because of the dense population in the city, the Federation would use a large number of sniper rifles. Therefore, he had never left the bustling business district. Using the tall buildings tightly huddled together to block the distant shots, he strictly followed the line of blind spots and madly ran. Hard pottery bulletproof vest, soft metal anti-cutting strips, guns were still guns. In close combat on the streets and alleys, there was simply no one who could stop him. However, after continuously being discovered and hunted down so many times in an extremely short period of time, he had consumed too much of his strength in an extremely short period of time. He couldn't stay in one place for more than 5 seconds. and exhaustion began to invade his body. Now was the most dangerous moment. The Federation government was almost crazy and began to broadcast the process of him being hunted down. Even at the great political risk, they wanted to mobilize the power of the people. This method was very powerful. Su Lu from the Empire suddenly became a rat crossing the street, caught in the vast ocean of the people's war. Every electronic valve in the streets and alleys was guarded by brave people holding wooden sticks. As for every Federation citizen he met who had once loved him, as long as they saw him now, their faces would become twisted and they would charge at him fearlessly. What was even more frightening was that madman Li should be in the combat force hunting him this time. Although Su Lu didn't see it, he could clearly feel the pressure. Closer, closer, and closer. The powerful and violent footsteps were right behind him. Madman Li had already seen Su Li's back in front of him. With a heavy expression, he sped up his steps, the soles of his feet pounding the ground like iron hammers. As long as he caught up and entangled that troublesome person, the Federation forces following closely behind would definitely be able to easily tear him to pieces. Snowflakes floated down from the sky without warning. Mixed in the snowflakes was the dull and determined sound of a gunshot. Li Feng's expression suddenly changed. His feet reacted extremely quickly and heavily stomped down, forcibly creating a small hole in the ground. His body violently trembled as he backed up, avoiding the high-speed gunshot from afar. Immediately after, 6 sniper rifle bullets were clearly and extremely intimidatingly fired in succession. Pooh! 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 On the ground and walls, 6 flowers of cement and dust instantly bloomed. The extremely precise bullets actually forced him out of the back alley of the building. The gunshot stopped. Li Feng turned his head and looked ahead. There was no trace of Su Lu in front of him. His expression was extremely ugly. 2 kilometers away, on one of the floors of the only building that could lock onto the back alley, Magnolia silently lowered her head and disassembled the sniper rifle. Her mouth continuously chewed on the orchid-flavored chewing gum. In the past year, she had gotten used to holding the kitchen knife in her hand, so her movements of disassembling the gun were still as smooth as before. The fluttering hair on her forehead had long been cut short, but her aura was still as seductive and enchanting. Chapter 836. More than 30 metal particles that looked like buttons flew out of Su Li's hand and into the corners of the building. Amidst the muffled popping sounds, the metal buttons exploded one after another, like balloons being stepped on by the guests at a wedding. Fine blue electric arcs appeared and disappeared. The low-intensity electric current formed a closed, self-melting electromagnetic field in the air, instantly destroying all the electronic chips in the room. The countless eyes and the glory of the charter were thus disabled. Finally, he had temporarily escaped the pursuit of the small-eyed combat unit of the Federation. He gasped for breath, wiped the sweat on his forehead, and lowered his head to quickly check his equipment and bulletproof vest. The hard ceramic shards in the inner lining of the bulletproof vest had already cracked in several places, and they were not very useful anymore. During the battle, he gradually grasped the feeling that Feng Yu had described. However, staying in each hiding place for no more than 2 minutes and not being able to let the central computer calculate his trajectory and escape habits was really tiring. The gunshots that rang out in the back alley of the big building clearly entered his ears. He roughly guessed what had happened. He slowly narrowed his eyes, and the emotions in his eyes were extremely complicated. He left the relatively safe wildlife sanctuary because he could not be a savage hiding in the mountains for dozens of years. Returning to the city was, of course, not to die, but to find a spaceship that belonged to him, to leave this planet. He was confident that as long as he distanced himself from the Bureau of Proclamation building, just like the precious 4 minutes and 12 seconds in the Donglin district, his whereabouts would not be detected by the central computer again. In addition, Su Lu did not deny what he had seen and heard on his difficult escape. The Federation that he once loved deeply no longer loved him. The feeling of being condemned and abandoned made him somewhat helpless and angry for no reason. So subconsciously, he wanted to do something crazy to prove something. Until the gunshots rang out, the crazy emotions in his heart suddenly calmed down. The gunshots were ironclad proof that he was not a wandering ghost in the Federation. Then, he had to be responsible for those who dared to be friends with ghosts in the daytime. If he did not find a way to leave this place by finding a spaceship, he had to fight with that damn computer in this damn city. Other than implicating some people, there was no other meaning. Doing this was not a bad guest, but a cheap guest. The scanners at the entrance of the mall silently scanned the chips on the back of the people's necks, and then transmitted the collected results to the automatic search workstation. The light screen that no one was looking at clearly showed the citizen's number, and the people carried shopping bags and prepared for the new year. With a calm smile on their faces, they did not care at all. The police officers on the streets held mobile scanning sticks in their hands and randomly selected passersby for inspection. The device accurately reported everyone's citizen number. The passersby and the police officers smiled and greeted each other. They did not have any strange emotional reactions to the data read by the chip behind their necks. The brim of the hat was pulled very low, covering most of his face. Sulu silently walked along the street, watching the scene. He felt a little strange. On this planet, he was probably the only one who didn't have a chip. According to Feng Yu's mockery and the habitual humiliation of the people of the Imperium, these identity chips were like cold dog chains tied to the cervical vertebrae of every citizen of the Federation. From the moment they were born, the tiny chip was implanted in their body, accompanying them as they learned to speak, to walk, to love, to get married, to have children, to work, and to struggle until they finally died. Along with this, the AI chip scans were carried out at all times, silently or peacefully in every part of the Federation. This had already become a way of life, deeply embedded in the lives of every Federation citizen. No one would find it strange or uncomfortable. In fact, most Federation citizens would not even remember that there was an ice-cold metal chip behind their necks until they died. Sulu was the same in the past, except for the first time when he nervously walked through the scanning channel of the spaceport when he arrived at the Capitol Ring. He never deliberately remembered that when he entered the cinema, the store, the classroom, or the military camp, he would be scanned by the glory of the charter on his body. It was only now that he had officially become the enemy of the charter that he began to pay attention to the details that were everywhere in his life. Without the chip behind his neck, he began to recall the life when he had the chip and clearly felt the coldness that was filled with the smell of machinery. This smell was not good. Sulu walked through the lawn by the street with his head lowered and circled to the back of a small building. He pushed open the door and walked in. His face was too pale because of the blood loss, and he appeared particularly weak under the dim light. The breathing between his thin lips was very heavy. What was even more frightening than the fatigue and injuries was the mental struggle, which made his situation very bad. The Federation was so big, but there was no place for him to stay. Even if it was just a humble request to stand, would this small building accept him? Sulu slowly pushed open the side door, his right hand in his pocket gently pulling the trigger. There was a faint, self-deprecating smile on his face. At this point, what else could he ask for? What could he prove? It was truly a ridiculous idea. However, since he was here, he had to try. When the antique wooden door was pushed open, he did not see Li Xiaodong as he expected. His expression and footsteps froze at the same time, making a slight sound on the floor. Beside the luxurious coastal-style dining table sat a beautiful young woman. She was wearing a light blue dress, and there was a faint charm between her eyebrows, but she was eating dinner alone. Hearing the sound of footsteps, the beautiful young woman turned around in shock. When she saw Su Li's face clearly, she subconsciously raised her hands and covered her mouth tightly, swallowing the subconscious cry of surprise that was about to come out. Su Li's right hand in his pocket slowly released the trigger. He smiled slightly and prepared to turn around and leave. He knew this beautiful woman. Thinking that she would inform the Federation to hunt him down, he could not help but feel a little gloomy. "You wait a minute." The woman hesitated and stood up with difficulty. Her right hand was on the table, and her voice was slightly trembling. "You haven't eaten yet, right?" It was a very simple sentence, but it was like a spring thunder resounding through the forest. This description was absolutely not an exaggeration. When the whole world had become so strange and cold, he suddenly heard a question with concern. Su Lu felt as if his tired body was soaked in warm spring water. He turned around somewhat stiffly, looked at the woman, and said with a smile, "Sister Lulu, can you cook?" In a certain manner, an old man from Liyuan Palace was wearing black clothes and a black round hat as he sat on a black ancient chair. Apart from age spots, there was more of an unfathomable wisdom or shrewd craftiness within the layers of wrinkles on his face. The hesitation on your face betrayed the content of the phone call just now. The old man smiled and looked at Li Xiaotong in front of him. He slowly raised his right hand and said, "In recent years, you have grown very fast. Now there are not many things that can make you lose yourself. It seems that Su Lu really found you." Li Xiaotong looked at the old man in shock. He forcibly suppressed the complicated emotions in his heart and explained as calmly as possible. "I had an agreement with him before. If there was the biggest trouble, I would meet him there. Now he is there. He needs a boat. I have decided that your brother will take over the position of the head of the family." The old man from Liyuan Palace was like Lady Tai. He was very good at making thunder in silence. Without warning, he said the important inheritance of one of the 7 families. Li Xiaotong's face was extremely ugly. He said in a low voice, "I understand. You don't understand." Liyuan Palace looked at him indifferently and said rudely, "This has nothing to do with the wrong investment. Although Su Lu is the biggest investment in your life, no one, including me, thought that he would be from the Empire. So this investment is not a mistake." The old man's voice was old and calm. A complicated smile appeared on his loose face. "I am a calculative man. My 2 biggest investments in recent years, one was Macklin, and the other was Su Lu. Unfortunately, both of them are F*King from the Empire." These F*King words came out from the old man's dry lips. It showed that even the head of the Li family couldn't help but feel that the encounters in the world were too strange and too speechless. The old man from Liyuan Palace continued with a smile. "The key reason why you can't take over the position of the head of the family is that you still don't understand that we are the purest businessmen. We can only have things like money in our eyes. Only by being focused enough can we resist the increasingly tough government." After a moment of silence, Li Xiaotong said, "I have already informed the government about Su Lu. The woman who lives in the other building is on good terms with Su Lu. I believe she can delay him for a while." The old man from the Liyuan Palace slowly furrowed his brows. He sighed with some disappointment and said, "Being able to make a decision in a short period of time is indeed an excellent quality that a leader must possess. However, in this matter, you have made another mistake." Li Xiaotong furrowed his brows and looked up in confusion. "You have already invested so much in Su Lu, including the last time he went to war with the government. You even helped him escape from the capital. Why are you now stopping this business plan in advance and selling him to the government when there is no return on your investment?" Right now, Li Xiaotong's heart was very heavy. He explained with a slightly hoarse voice, "But he is from the Empire. I said earlier that we are doing business. We can only have things in our eyes." The old man from Liyuan Palace sighed and said, "Since that is the case, why do you still care whether the target of your investment is from the Empire or the Federation? In the past, our Li family didn't have the opportunity to do business with the people from the Empire. Right now, this is the best opportunity. He may be a prince of the Empire. Then, as long as he is alive, there is a high possibility that he will become the emperor of the Empire in the future. If you had persisted in this investment to the end, then this would not only be the greatest investment in your life, it could even be ranked in the top 3 in the history of the family. Other than back then, when our ancestors resolutely sold all the family property to help Emperor C, where else can we find a project with such an astonishing return on investment? What a pity, what a pity." Li Xiaotong was silent and speechless. The reason why he had made such a decision earlier was actually very simple. It was because over the years, it was very difficult for him to simply view Su Lu as an investment target, but as a friend. When one's best friend suddenly became a person from the Empire, who could be absolutely rational and calm and not feel helpless and desperate. Chapter 837. There was a knock on the door. Bai Yulan walked out of the kitchen and yelled in the direction of the bedroom. "I'll open the door." She wiped the oil on her hands on her apron and walked to the living room to open the door. Seeing the armed military police outside, her expression didn't change at all. When the Federation's combat troops had just entered the block and started to surround the apartment, she had already noticed it, so she wasn't surprised to see them when she opened the door. She just didn't expect that the leader was actually that young colonel. Bai Yulan looked at Li Feng and said, "I didn't expect you to be involved in such a small matter like catching me." Li Feng said indifferently, "Unless I did it myself, I really didn't have the confidence to catch the famous 7th group old Bai. In fact, if you were involved in a first-order incident, the Bureau of Proclamation would have traced the location. Then no one would have found out that you were the one who fired those shots. You did a great job." Bai Yulan looked at the Federation's soldiers in the corridor who were holding their guns tightly. She slowly loosened the apron around her waist and calmly replied, "Don't be so nervous. I never thought of running away." Li Feng slightly frowned and looked at her in confusion. Then he glanced over her shoulder and saw a pregnant woman holding the wall and walking out of the bedroom. She had a big belly and looked very tired. Bai Yulan heard the footsteps behind her, and her eyebrows slightly twitched. Her arm that was holding the apron became a little stiff. Her eyes that were looking at Li Feng suddenly brightened. Li Feng was silent for a moment and looked at the pregnant woman who was full of confusion. He said with a blank expression, "The government has a special mission. They need to recruit outstanding officers to re-enter the army. Your husband has to go for a period of special training." Inside the dark green bulletproof military vehicle. "How many months?" Li Feng asked. Bai Yulan slightly lowered her eyes and looked at the cold shackles on her hands and feet. She softly replied, "Soon." Li Feng slightly frowned and lit the cigarette between his lips. After a short pause, he also lit one for Bai Yulan. He shook his head and said, "I really don't understand why you still want to help him in this situation. Don't forget that he is from the Empire." "I don't believe it," Bai Yulan calmly replied. "I don't want to believe that he's from the Empire either." Li Feng removed the cigarette from his lips and spat out of the car. "But this is the truth." Bai Yulan was silent for a long time before replying with a smile. "It doesn't matter." Li Feng's frown deepened. Bai Yulan raised her handcuffed hands, removed the cigarette from her lips, and explained softly, "I joined the army when I was 15 years old. At that time, the old commander's unit was still called the 17th Division, not the 83-84 Division. Later, I was transferred to Baishui City to do some assassination work for the government. After that, the 7th Division started to do some private work." "What are you trying to say?" Li Feng asked expressionlessly. "Everyone in the army knows that Group 7 has always been a mercenary army. I'm a mercenary who only recognizes money." Bai Yulan calmly said, "Little boss gave me more than 20 million. This amount of money is enough for me to sell my life several times over." Li Feng naturally wouldn't accept this explanation. But as someone who also grew up in the army, he didn't need to explain. He could roughly understand why Bai Yulan made this choice. The dark green bulletproof military vehicle fell into silence. Bai Yulan turned her head and looked out of the window. She looked at the fluttering snowflakes outside the building of the Four States Foundation with no expression on her face. At that time, he was responsible for long-range sniping and assisting Su Lu, but he left at the most critical moment. Now, he was far away from those years of fighting. His wife was pregnant, but he pulled the trigger at the most critical moment for Su Lu. The gunshot rang out again after a few years. It was the same gunshot from that year. The warm restaurant of the small building, the light blue coastal-style dining table, and the beautiful girl in the light blue dress created a warm and comfortable feeling. In this warmth, Su Lu lowered his head and quickly ate plate after plate of food. Lulu watched with a smile on her face. The two of them occasionally talked and then returned to silence. It was a feeling of home. The difficult escape and battle made Su Li's stomach very hungry. The taste of mashed potatoes mixed with synthetic fat and green bean paste was actually not very good. But at this time, there was no time for it to swirl around on his taste buds. Lulu was a river-like person. She was very beautiful and young, but she had been in a certain industry for many years. In the autumn of the 66th year of the constitutional era, she once saw a male student sleeping soundly on a bench in a certain brothel in Linhai Prefecture. She once bent her fair and tender legs, painted her nails red, and painted the male student's face red. They gathered together and played cards together, and then she laughed without the slightest restraint. A few years later, that male student became a famous war hero of the Federation. Lulu, on the other hand, was still working in this industry. It was just that the location of her work had changed to the Sunset region of the West Forest region. In that luxurious nightclub, she bravely sat beside the war hero. After that, she had a night of memories of Mozo teasing, fighting, getting drunk, vomiting, and promises. After that night, the war hero sent her back to the capital ring and asked a friend with an amazing family to take care of her. From then on, although Sister Lulu was still in this industry, she no longer had to serve anyone. She began to manage several high-class nightclubs and managed thousands of young and beautiful girls. She became a real sister. When she saw him again today, he was no longer the poor student and war hero of the past, but an imperial spy who was being hunted down by the Federation. "I thought you were already married and had children. I didn't expect to see you again." Sula looked up at her and said with a smile, "It seems asking Li Xiaotong to take care of you was a mistake." Lulu's eyes moved as she looked at him quietly and said softly, "A person like me who hasn't studied much is used to this industry. I really don't know what else to do. Li Qixiao is a good person. Although I know he did it because of you, in the end he helped me too much." The phone on the table rang. Lulu picked it up and listened to a few words. Her brows slightly furrowed, and she walked to the window and whispered something. One could faintly see that her left hand, which was hanging by the side of her blue dress, was somewhat stiff. Sulu at the table was still eating the last plate of food and didn't notice this. After hanging up the phone, she slowly clenched her fists and suddenly turned around. Looking at Sulu, she said with a trembling voice, "Let's go." It was a very simple action and a sentence, but who knew how much courage it took? Even though she knew what kind of tragic consequences this decision would bring, the resolute expression on Lulu's face showed that she did not experience too much of a complicated psychological struggle before she did it. Sulu understood what had happened. It seemed that he couldn't wait for his boat tonight. He wasn't disappointed or angry about Li Xiaotong's betrayal, but he was somewhat tired. He looked at Lulu and said bitterly, "I'm really from the Empire. I'm a prostitute, but from the beginning until now, you haven't looked down on me, so don't feel like you owe me anything." Lulu squeezed out a smile, took the coat from the hanger, and walked to him. She put it on for him and said with a trembling voice, "If we're talking about owing, you still owe me one night." After saying this, she hugged Sulu tightly and offered her hot red lips to him. Her lips and tongue trembled because of fear, passionately asked for his lips. She kissed him with tears flowing down her cheeks. The hot lips and tongue separated. Sulu quietly looked at the girl. She took a pen and paper from the table and scribbled a few words. She whispered a few words and then left silently. The flashing police lights made the snowflakes on the street look strange. The snowflakes fell on a light-colored table through the window, like a modern abstract painting that no one could understand. The fully armed special forces of the Federation carefully searched the small building from inside to outside several times. Except for a few bloody footprints at the back door, they found nothing. In a room on the second floor, a secretary of the Li family looked at Lulu with a gloomy expression and said in a cold voice, "Miss Lulu, you have been in the entertainment industry for many years, so there should be no problem in acting. Everyone knows that the Empire people value old friendships very much, so I don't understand why you can't just stall him for 2 minutes." Lulu's hands tightly grasped the hem of her dress, but she didn't know where to look outside the window. After a long silence, she said, I don't want to act, and you probably don't understand. I'm also a person who values old friendships very much. The secretary of the Lee family pointed at her face and humiliated her in a harsh voice. You are just a prostitute. Sister Lulu slowly turned her head and looked at him expressionlessly. Even if I'm a prostitute, there are some things that I don't want to sell. That's a good sentence. It makes me feel ashamed. Li Xiaodong opened the door and walked in. He silently looked at the woman on the bed and said, "But you should know very well what kind of price you have to pay. I have mentally prepared to die, but someone told me that I must not die." Lulu stood up from the bed and handed a note to Li Xiaotong. Li Xiaotong recognized the scribbled handwriting, and his eyes slightly narrowed. He saw a few words written on the note. I still ask you to continue to protect her, at least until my death is confirmed. Otherwise, my madness will frighten the entire Federation. As the heir of the Li family, you can see this as a fun bet, and I suggest you bet that I can survive. Li Xiaotong looked at the note and slightly frowned. After a moment, he laughed self-deprecatingly, took out a lighter, and burned the note to ashes. Then he calmly said to Lulu, "Pack up and come with me." The note had been burned, but the words on it had been left in the depths of his heart. He knew that Su Lu was a man of his words. So, as the note said, if he didn't want to see a crazy doomsday scene, he must protect Lulu's safety until it was confirmed that Su Lu or he died. In a secluded street in the southern part of the capital, a slanted stone path extended to the entrance of a department store. Su Lu silently looked at that place, lowered the brim of his hat, and walked up. His mood was no longer irritable, bewildered, and confused, but unusually calm. Now he was very clear that he couldn't die, and had to live as vigorously as before. Chapter 838. The Foothill Department Store was a wonderful place, at least for Su Lu. In his youth, which was full of the color of escape, only this store, which was hidden at the end of the stone path in the neighboring mountain of the city, and the small courtyard in the slums of the Tianjing planet of the Empire, could bring him a real sense of relaxation. The biggest difference between the former and the latter was that the kind mother and son in the small courtyard was the source of the sense of relaxation, while the department store permeated the walls and even the air. Today, he didn't buy the energy bars used by students. He took a bottle of inferior liquor and 2 bags of peanuts from the depths of the shelves and walked to the small table at the entrance. He lowered his head and silently took out the change in his pocket, put it in front of the boss, and turned to leave. The gray-haired boss put down the bowl of instant noodles in his hand and didn't count the money. He looked at Su Lu, who was about to walk out of the door, and said mockingly, "You are getting more and more impolite. In the past, you at least knew to call me Boss Xiaoshan." Su Li's back stiffened slightly. He turned his head and took off his hat. He looked at him and said bitterly, "How come you can recognize me every time? I have been running a store all my life, and I have never met a fugitive who dared to come back to buy things from me again and again like you did. I even knew that I had already recognized you when the president made the announcement. A fugitive like you is really rare, so of course, it is not easy to forget." Su Lu was silent for a moment and said, "But this time is different from the last time. I am now a citizen of the Empire. There's a saying that goes, 'Old friends are as good as new. Old friends are as before.' You may not understand the meaning of this saying, but it roughly means that some people are still strangers even after spending a lifetime with each other, while some people can become lifelong friends just by stopping the car and chatting for a while." The boss looked at him and said expressionlessly, "Of course, there is no such friendship between us, but in my opinion, you can be considered an interesting guy, so I'm willing to spare some precious time to chat with you." The owner of the department store, who was over 50 years old and looked very ordinary, spoke in a very ordinary and simple way. However, the words he occasionally used, such as the 2 sentences, were interesting. This department store was far away from the downtown area and was located in a remote mountainside forest. Its business wasn't very good. Even the sparrows in the forest dared to proudly pace in front of the door. Looking at such a small store, one's life was probably consumed by the boring TV news and the instant noodles that were hard and soft. So how could it be considered precious? Sulu scratched his head with his empty hand, not knowing what to say. Then what should we talk about? The owner, namely Xiaoshan, tapped the table with his knuckles, looked at the liquor and peanuts in his hand, and said with a frown, "According to the news, you shouldn't be in the mood to drown your sorrows. It doesn't matter what you talk about. The point is that I don't want to see someone waste the liquor in my shop." "Then how do we not waste it?" Sulu asked doubtfully. "If you treat me to a few drinks, it won't be a waste," said Li Xiaoshan's boss. A bottle of wine quickly entered their stomachs, and then a second bottle was opened. The dishes to go with the wine were peanuts, a few bags of low-quality snacks sold exclusively to students, and 2 boxes of instant noodles that were really soaked to mush. Sulu, whose alcohol tolerance was not good, had a layer of vigorous red on his slightly tanned cheeks. Looking at the afterglow of the winter coming through the high-rise building across the hillside, he burped, narrowed his eyes, and said, "I don't want to get on other people's boats because I know very well that once I get on, I will never be able to get off. But it's also stupid to stay here. It doesn't make any sense except to implicate those guys like you who don't care that I'm from the Empire." He finished the cup of low-quality liquor in one gulp, licked his lips with a painful expression, and looked at Li Xiaoshan's boss and said, "From the last escape to this one, in fact, I've escaped many times before. I'm really tired and don't want to escape anymore. But the problem is that I don't want to go on other people's boats. It's wrong to stay here, but I don't want to die. What do you think I should do?" The so-called asking for advice was actually nothing more than venting his pent-up emotions. Before the boss could answer, he shook his head and said self-deprecatingly, "I've never regretted anything in my life. But right now, I'm really regretting it. I feel that this emotion is very strange, very awkward." Li Xiaoshan put the cup to his lips and slowly and silently drank the liquor in the cup without making any sound. Then he picked up 2 peanuts and a piece of dried tofu and threw them into his mouth, chewing hard without paying attention to the details, and then let out a sigh of satisfaction. He looked at Sulu, whose face was full of sorrow, and said mockingly, "Man is really an animal that is not easily satisfied. You were just an orphan in the East Forest, and now you're a prince of the Empire. You can eat meat without any scruples. What's wrong with life?" This is very similar to what an uncle of mine said. Sulu filled his cup with liquor and said with a smile. The owner of Mountley Mountain ate a few more peanuts and dried tofu. He chewed hard, and the muscles around his jaw seemed to be particularly strenuous. He said vaguely, "My ancestor once passed on the words of a wise man before his death. When you chew pickles and beans together, you will taste like walnuts. But I like another sentence better. If you eat peanuts and dried tofu together, you will taste like ham." Before you were executed, you couldn't forget this sentence. This is the attitude you should have in life. The meaning of life is to eat meat and drink wine, to eat and to wait for death. When you understand this, you probably won't be like now, living such a tiring life at such a young age. Sulu stared at the wine cup between his fingers and murmured, "How can it be so easy to understand?" The boss swallowed the noodles in the bowl and continued to scold him vaguely. "If you really took the ticket and boarded that ship and followed the normal path, would you regret it when you were about to die?" Sulu thought about it seriously and then replied, "Yes, although it hasn't happened yet. At least I will for now." A young man regretting the ending that hadn't happened yet when he was old was a very clever way of saying it. The boss laughed out loud and said, "Then what are you thinking about?" "I want to leave. I want to have my own ship." Sulu slowly turned the wine cup between his fingers and looked at the boss with narrowed eyes. His eyes were very bright, and he said sincerely, "Can you help me? This is really not a joke." The boss waved his chopsticks like a sword, and the soup splashed everywhere. "This is a joke passed down by my ancestor. I have studied it for half of my life, but I still don't know what's so funny about it. I guess it's because of this serious lack of information. As for the ship, I've been here all my life. I have never even been to the cinema at the foot of the mountain, let alone the space tourism." Sula knew that the other party was not joking. He stared at his eyes in shock and asked, "You have been here all your life? You must have been to school, right?" "I'm a self-taught genius." The boss paused and didn't continue to explain the joke related to these 4 words. Then wouldn't you suffocate to death? Sulu looked at him thoughtfully. Can a living person suffocate to death? The boss frowned and said, you can surf the internet, order takeout by phone, watch TV, and when you're bored, you can go to the reserve to hunt. It's a good life. Reserve? Sulu looked at the man who couldn't see clearly and asked. The boss stopped his futile attempt to fish out the whole noodle from the batter, pointed to the back of the mountain with the tip of the chopsticks dripping with soup, and said, go over this mountain, and you can see the wall of the reserve. Who the hell are you? Su Li's hand that was holding the wine glass was a bit stiff. In fact, he had always felt that the boss of this mountain department store was not an ordinary person, so he tried to ask about the ship. But he didn't expect that this very ordinary-looking man with gray hair could ignore the glory of the charter and go over the electronic wall. My surname is Li, and my name is Li Shaoshan. I have said it 3 times, and you still don't remember? Why is it that every time I come to your store, I feel very relaxed, or even comfortable? The boss looked at the young man's moved face and said, because in my small store, sunlight, wind and rain can enter, and people can enter, but the glory of the charter can't enter. Sulu scratched his head and couldn't hide the shock on his face. After a long silence, he suddenly frowned and asked in confusion, is there anyone with the surname Li in the 7 big families? Are you telling me that you are another powerful person in the Lees of Philadelphia? Don't talk about such a useless thing. The boss wiped the soup on his lips and said, I have nothing to do with those big shots. Sulu felt that what he had seen and heard today was beyond his imagination. The man in front of him actually said that the glory of the charter, which shrouded the universe, couldn't shine into this shabby department store. It was really hard to understand and unimaginable. He subconsciously picked up the wine glass and drank it, using the rough spiciness to dilute the confusion in his mind. Then why can't the glory of the charter come in? Because this store and the mountain behind it belong to my family. When the electronic surveillance network was built, this place was excluded. I don't have the eyes of the central computer here. As for the history story, I will tell you next time when I have the chance. Sulu covered his forehead and said with emotion, you are too mysterious. I don't understand. It's really uncomfortable. Speaking of next time, after I walk out of here today, there won't be a next time. You can stay. The boss looked at him and said lightly, if you really don't have a place to go, then stay. No one can find you. Sulu shook his head and said with a smile, I have already implicated a lot of people. Although I know you are not an ordinary person and what you said may be true, I still can't stay. It's okay. Your first sequence protection authority has been stripped. It just so happens that I still have first sequence protection authority. That broken computer won't allow the Federation's armed personnel to deal with me. The boss said, today, in this department store at the foot of the mountain, Sulu actually calmed down very quickly after hearing that he had first sequence protection authority. After a long silence, he said bitterly, your store is too small, and I still have a lot of things to do. This place is indeed too small. The boss's smile suddenly became a little bleak. He said with emotion, throughout the countless years of my family, countless children couldn't stand the loneliness and chose to be implanted into the glory of the charter. In the end, I was the only one who persisted. It's not easy to meet someone like me who doesn't have a chip behind his neck. I thought I could have a companion. If I can't handle it, I'll come back to you. I know this is a little shameless, but if I can find my own ticket, I'll definitely come to see you in the future. Go. The boss waved his hand. Sulu packed his luggage and walked out of the door. He suddenly stopped and turned back to ask, can you tell me who your ancestor is? The boss threw the bowl of instant noodles into the cardboard box at his feet and said with his head down, my ancestor is still in the Charter Square. Of course, I never had the chance to see him, but when I thought about how he was forced to stand there and be sized up after so many years, being exposed to the wind, rain, sun, and pigeon feces, it might be better not to see him. Suli's expression was very interesting. He thought about the 7 great families and the Lees of Philadelphia, but he didn't expect the answer to be the group of 5 that was about to become a legend. My ancestor liked to eat meat and hunt. He didn't like chips. The boss raised his head and looked at him expressionlessly. Although he had a ticket, it was a five-person ship, so he didn't have the final say. During the voting, the guy with thick eyebrows and big eyes who decided to support him at the beginning actually betrayed the revolution after the regulations were changed to allow people to eat fish. So the result of the voting became 3-2. The white-haired man shrugged and said mockingly, "Democracy, you know." Sula knew what to say. "I'll give you one last thing." The boss looked at him and said with a smile, "After the great calamity, the five-person ship came to this star field. There was no federation in the universe. Similarly, I believe the situation in the left sky star field is similar. There was no empire before. In the beginning, there were no people from the Federation or the Empire, only people. So you don't have to struggle to be a Federation person or an Empire person. Just be a person." Hearing this last sentence, Sulu was silent for a long time. In the twilight, he bowed deeply to the boss and said, "Thank you for your care these days, for the nutrition bars and wine, and for today's wonderful story and these words." The sun had just sunk halfway when the leaden clouds and snowflakes impatiently shrouded the city and began to impatiently drive it away. The winter wind whistled through the streets. Sulu, who had drunk nearly an entire bottle of wine, was already past the level of drunkenness, but he didn't feel cold at all. The conversation with the department store owner at the foot of the mountain had finally untied the knot in the deepest part of his heart. His mind was in chaos, and his mind was clear. The Federation people, the Empire people, the East Forest people, the Upper Forest people, the West Woods people, the South Kazhou people, the Shisha people, the Dashi people, the Sunset people, the Li people, the Mo Hua people, the Tianjing people, men, women, old people, good people, ancestors, and descendants were all people. And by Yulan's opinion, Sulu was only good at simplifying complicated things, so he decided to simply divide people into bad and good people in the future. After figuring this out, he called Madman Li under the influence of alcohol. He burped and then said, "Let Lao Bai go. Don't make a good person flip out." Chapter 839. On the snowy street, beside his cheeks that were burning because of the cheap liquor, Madman Li's clear and cold reply came from the phone. "You can let him go, but you have to trade yourself for it." There was a path hidden in the woods ahead. The temperature from the cement road melted the snowflakes quickly. Compared to the piles of snow on the side of the road, the black and white were distinct and deep. At the end of the road, there were a few cornices and the hills of the winter forest. Sula narrowed his eyes and said, "If you really force me, go crazy? I'm not Du Shaoqing, and this is not the training base from back then." Madman Li's cold voice came very quickly, and he mocked without holding back. "If the Federation doesn't let him go, how are you going to go crazy? Burn down our houses, kill our men and children, and rape our women? No, you can't do that. Don't think that you can become a real terrorist because you're drunk on the emotions of a hero at the end of his road. Even if you've assassinated Macklin and killed many people, you can't use that to threaten the Federation, much less me." Sulu walked along the black and white road into the depths of the winter forest. He slowly stopped in front of an antique stone statue and said calmly to the other side of the phone, "For an unlucky person like me, in such a desperate situation, I still can't do what you said. Then, I should be a good person, right?" The other side of the phone was silent. A good person has a reason and a right to live. Sulu took a deep breath, shook his arm, and flipped over the heavy stone statue in front of him. He said, "Those who help good people live also have a reason to live, like Lao Bai." The heavy stone statue fell to the ground with a muffled thud, splashing snow and mud. Madman Li on the other side of the phone still didn't say anything. Sulu knew that the glory of the charter was accurately locating him at this moment, but he didn't care. He jumped into the hole covered by the stone statue, expressionlessly, and continued. "Since I came to the capital ring from Donglin, I've been listening to and reading a sentence. There is no reason in the universe. Today, I'll show you a reason. If you found me, come quickly and send me someone useful." Madman Li on the other side of the phone finally spoke. It was obvious that he was suppressing his anger and absurdity. His tone was extremely cold. Even if my grandfather comes back to life, it's impossible to defeat the Federation and the glory of the Charter. Sulu patted off the wet mud on the big box in the pit and replied, "We'll only know after we fight." Madman Lee roared violently. "If you want to die, then kill yourself. Don't drag others down. Declare war on the Federation? Are you crazy or drunk?" Sulu pushed the heavy box to the ground and burped while rubbing his stomach. Smelling the pungent smell of alcohol and peanut instant noodles around him, he couldn't help but frown and reply, somewhat embarrassedly, "I really drank too much." Sulu had never fought a battle without preparation. The heavy box buried under the stone statue was the backup ammunition that he had buried in advance before the first war with the Federation. Because the firepower of these guns was too fierce, he had never used them when he was inexplicably turned into a citizen of the Imperium and was hunted down by the Federation for many days. Until today, the heavy box that was almost as tall as his chest was dragged quickly on the snow, crushing the frozen soil and frost grass. A large pile of snow and mud accumulated in front of the box, but it didn't slow down at all. In a very short time, it entered a quiet and noble garden building. This place was called the Ivy Garden. The seventh young master of the Li family, Li Xiaotong, lived here. In the front and back of the villa, all the people who lived in it were famous people of the Federation, high officials, and nobles. It was very far away from the world of the common people. It was a very cold winter, but there was artificial warming water flowing in the garden. Accompanied by the odorless fragrance of the winter plums, white snow covered the antique cornices. It was very interesting. This was the battlefield that Sulu had chosen. During this period of time on the run, he had only been running and had not launched a counterattack. There were many complicated psychological reasons for this, but now he had to launch a counterattack. Because of Lulu, because of Lao Bai, the government might even investigate Zhou Yu. Therefore, other than being strong enough to survive, he had to use a certain method to display his powerful destructive power. He had to make the federal government feel pain and fear. Of course, he had to admit that the 2 bottles of low-quality liquor in the department store at the foot of the mountain also played a very important role at this time. Standing on a platform that led to an underground heating pump room with 3 thick walls and water behind it, Sulu fiercely spat into the stream that was piled with snow, smashed open the box, and began to organize the guns with an expressionless face. His brain began to work quickly, once again planning the escape route after the battle. A buzzing sound came from below the clouds in the distance. The shadows of dozens of twin-armed helicopters could be faintly seen in the snow. Although they were far away, the momentum was still very shocking. The snowflakes danced like a young girl's skirt. The sky was gloomy, but he could still see. The sun in the west had already set. He didn't know if it was the end of someone. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked in that direction. His hands moved quickly, and the automatic sniper rifle with the electric valve removed made a clicking sound. That day in the wet, he didn't get on other people's boats. In the end, there was no boat. But now he had an escape route. Although the world at the end of the escape route was small and strange, there were instant noodles, peanuts, and this damned liquor. What was there to be afraid of? With a whoosh, his arms accurately and quickly raised like a machine. In an instant, he perfectly aimed and prepared to fire. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. The direction of the H-12 sniper rifle was not the helicopter in the snowy sky, but the winter forest at the other end of the stream. The vigorous fire shone out from the black muzzle. The air around the muzzle suddenly shook. The snowflakes first froze, and then they were torn apart and melted. Pop, 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 pop. Once the sniper rifle fired, it didn't stop. Across the extreme shooting distance, it sprayed high-speed bullets toward the stream. Countless muffled groans sounded in the winter forest where not even a shadow could be seen. The faint sound of heavy objects falling to the ground could be heard. Sulu stood with his feet in front of him. He narrowed his eyes and maintained the most perfect shooting posture. He completely ignored the bullets coming from the opposite side. With an expressionless face, his right index finger moved quickly like lightning. He was actually using the sniper rifle as a repeating gun. The modified H-12 sniper rifle could adapt to such an abnormal shooting speed, but no matter how strong the barrel was, it couldn't withstand such continuous and fierce fire. In less than 20 seconds, the barrel had already started to turn red. Occasionally, snowflakes would fall, and with a whoosh, they would turn into mist. Without waiting for the cartridge to empty, Sulu accurately calculated the time the barrel could withstand. At the last moment before the barrel burst, he threw away the H-12 sniper rifle in his hand. With a snap of his right hand, another H-12 sniper rifle immediately appeared in front of him. He continued to fire continuously from a long distance. The sound of gunfire didn't seem to have stopped at all. On the embankment in the distance opposite the stream, the sound of gunfire had long been heard. Occasionally, shrapnel would sweep past his body and hit the wall with a dense and crisp sound. There was even a piece of shrapnel that was lucky enough to hit his chest. It fiercely pierced into the heavily damaged hard ceramic bulletproof vest under his jacket. However, Sulu only slightly bent his knees. His face paled, but there was still no change in his emotions. He just stood there in the wind and snow and silently fired. Feng Yu had once said in the middle of the wetlands that dealing with the charter computer was, in fact, dealing with the people who used the charter computer. Sulu chose to start the battle here. Starting the battle now was to determine that the Federation government couldn't possibly use a truly destructive weapon to deal with him. This was the capital, a densely populated area. This was the Ivy Garden where the powerful resided. Even the most precise guided missile would cause irreparable consequences. More importantly, Sulu had gradually come to understand that politicians were businessmen. They were greedy and incomparably confident. When they thought that they didn't need to pay a higher price to get rid of him, then they definitely wouldn't pay a higher price. In the gray and black sky on the other side of the wind and snow, dozens of twin-rotor armed helicopters were approaching at high speed. The atmosphere was solemn and terrifying. The rocket launchers on both sides of the cabin could be launched at any time. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at the federal forces that were already faintly appearing on the other side of the winter forest. He placed the sniper rifle in front of him and directly lifted the two large weapons. The six-barreled rotary Darling machine gun began to fiercely spit out flames. The high-speed stream of bullets cut the snowy sky into pieces of broken space. In the winter forest on the other side of the stream, a ricochet line that represented death suddenly appeared. Countless hard arbor trees, following the slight movement of the gun barrel, burst into mournful white fragments and bloomed with a bang. This was the Federal Force's most powerful firearm. On a crowded battlefield, it was even more terrifying than the ACW. It was usually installed in military mechas or armed helicopters. Other than a monster like Xiong Lin Quan, not many people could use it in single combat. At this time, Sulu was holding the two six-barrel Darling machine guns and fiercely firing. His arms, which did not look ridiculously muscular, appeared to be extraordinarily relaxed. Even the powerful reaction force only made his shoulders shake slightly. It looked like he was expressing his contempt for the federal forces in all directions. The Small Eyes Special Forces in the winter forest were directly suppressed by the terrifying rain of bullets on the embankment. They could not raise their heads at all. No matter how strong the troops were, in the face of such inhuman firepower, they had to temporarily avoid the front line. If the two terrifying six-barrel Darling's bullets were slightly lower, even the frozen and abnormally hard embankment would have been flipped over a few layers. The ammunition in the box on the platform was rapidly decreasing. The buzzing, high-speed rotation of the six-gun barrels began to turn red. It was just unknown whether the bullets would run out first or the gun barrels would collapse first. However, Sulu did not care about this. As soon as he finished suppressing the fire, he quickly raised the H-12 sniper rifle again and pointed diagonally into the air. He continuously pulled the trigger at the nearest armed helicopter flying in the air. The two completely different shooting methods switched so quickly without the slightest feeling of stagnation and awkwardness. The sniper rifle's bullet accurately cut through the snowy sky and hit the right rotor arm of the helicopter. The dull sound of metal breaking suddenly rang out, and a burst of sparks burst out from the rotor arm. The helicopter, which had lost its balance, twisted and turned, and fell into the cold lake, creating a large splash. Sulu immediately aimed at another armed helicopter at a 74-degree angle to the right. The special forces of Small Eyes in the winter forest were about to enter the next wave of attacks. He did not have the ability to deal with dozens of armed helicopters. He had to finish today's battle as soon as possible, then quickly retreat, then hide, and then fight again. However, the development of the situation was completely different from what he had imagined. Just as he was about to pull the trigger in a frenzy under the influence of alcohol, a drop of water splashed into his eyes, and his vision was suddenly blurred. At this moment, Su Lun narrowed his eyes and thought. The place where the helicopter fell into the lake was clearly a full 2 kilometers away from his shooting position. Why did the splash of water splash into his eyes? What followed was 1 drop of water, 2 drops of water, 3 drops of water, 10 drops of water, 100 drops of water, countless drops of water. The water droplets gathered into a downpour, falling from the dark clouds of snow, pitter-patter, falling on the ivy garden, which was no longer as tranquil and noble, and falling on his body. Sulu, who was wet and cold all over, was silent. Why did it rain so freely on such a cold, snowy day? The drooping clouds he was looking at suddenly changed. It was as if there was an invisible force that was slanting forward from a sky above his head. The ink-black snow clouds were extremely disturbed by this force. They scattered in all directions in fear, forming an exceptionally clear line. On both sides of the stream, everyone above the snowy sky seemed to hear a loud buzzing sound at this moment, but it also seemed like they did not hear anything. They just subconsciously forgot about the battle and turned their gazes to the end of the rolling cloud line. The end of the rolling cloud line suddenly tore open, revealing a huge hole. The setting sun, which had already sunk into the horizon, generously left behind a brilliant twilight like peach blossoms in that part of the sky. A spaceship bathed in this beautiful twilight, seemingly slow, but in reality, it was descending at an extremely fast speed. This black spaceship's body was densely packed with metal components using some unknown method. It was completely impossible to tell what it originally looked like. It could not even be described as broken. It was more like a pile of old and abandoned metal components that had been stored in a space garbage station for hundreds of thousands of years. However, it was such a dilapidated spaceship that descended in the final twilight, but it was enough to give the people who witnessed all of this an incomparably shocking psychological feeling. The terrifying air turbulence caused by the high-speed descent of the broken black spaceship instantly made dozens of armed helicopters around it lose their proud mobility. Several helicopters lost control and miserably fell into the lake, while the armed helicopters further away, in panic, retreated at the highest speed in all directions. The strong whistling wind passed through the ivy garden, blowing the antique cornice to the point that it was on the verge of collapsing. The cold, resistant flowers on a certain balcony shattered into pieces. The federal forces in the winter forest could not even raise their heads. Sulu narrowed his eyes as he looked at the approaching spaceship. He frowned and did not understand what was going on. He subconsciously raised 6 tubes down again and aimed at that direction. I have already poured so much cold water on you. Do you still want to continue your drunken madness? An exaggerated, mocking laughter came from the broken black spaceship, descending towards the platform he was on. It brought a large shadow into the manor, as if it was a demon that wanted to devour souls. But in Su Li's eyes, this demon was extremely cute. He threw away the heavy dollar in his hand and thought with a smile, "So I really do have my own spaceship." Chapter 840. There was darkness in front of him, and a strange, sweet smell came from the tip of his nose. Sula knew why there was such a smell in the spaceship. Just like when he was sweeping around with the 2 six-barrel darlings, there was no way for him to recognize that the broken spaceship that broke through the clouds was the tri-winged spaceship that had saved him from the Empire. There is always a difference in the degree of being broken. Back then, the tri-wing spaceship was still considered to be in good taste, but today it had become something beyond the imagination of the most absurd human artist. Because he did not recognize the tri-winged spaceship, he did not expect to hear the old man's voice in the spaceship. The voice was familiar yet strange, and it sounded much younger. In particular, there was a strong sense of mockery in the tone, with the mocking tone of an aristocrat, but it was so unforgettable. The soft lights turned on one by one, revealing the messy space in the spaceship in front of him. As soon as he entered the light, he could not help but squint his eyes, looking at the dusty console in front of him and the equipment that was welded to the hard alloy plate. He scratched his head and asked in disbelief, "Aren't you dead?" "I'm not you. You're an ape-like life form made of low-level carbon-based structures. How can you die so easily?" Someone's voice sounded in the tri-winged spaceship. Sulu confirmed that this voice belonged to him, and confirmed that it was indeed younger and livelier than before. A smile that came from the deepest part of his heart, mixed with fatigue, rushed to his cheeks. He opened his arms and made a hug to the invisible waves in the air. He sighed and said, "Don't play the trick of faking your death in the future. For a low-level, ape-like life form like us to cry because of the death of a high-level mechanical life form like you, it's not a very glorious thing." "Have you ever cried?" Philip asked curiously. The slender mechanical arm in front of the console moved down at high speed, and the video camera at the front was very close to Su Li's face. It seemed to want to find tears on his slightly dark and thin cheeks, but in the end, it only found some water stains. He said in a bad mood, "I'm the one who splashed the water. When did I cry?" Sulu raised his eyebrows and said angrily, "Try crying. I'll see if there's anything on your face in a few months." "I've never cried before. Although some conflicts in the core program can be compared to human emotions, I've never found any similar emotions. Perhaps there were, but I actively excluded them." Philip said indifferently. That slender mechanical arm kept waving in front of Sulu like a child waving his arm to show that he didn't care about anything and that he had to pretend to be strong because his disguise was mature. Knowing that this guy was still alive, Sulu was in a very good mood. He was too lazy to continue the argument that had been repeated many times with him. He turned around and prepared to walk to the rear cabin to prepare for what to do next. Unexpectedly, he tripped over something and almost fell. Looking down, he saw a heavy bag tightly tied to the ground. "Oh, right, there's something I forgot to tell you." The mechanical arm was accompanied by a pleasant hydraulic sound as it quickly extended to his face. Philip's voice was a little strange, as if he was a little nervous. Sulu didn't pay attention to what this guy wanted to explain. His gaze left the bag and fell on the depths of the rear cabin. The shock in his eyes didn't disappear for a long time, and he didn't know how to interpret the scene in front of him. Under the dim and gentle light, there was a little girl wearing fluffy earmuffs. Under her long and slightly trembling eyelashes, her black gem-like eyes narrowed into two crescent moons in the sky. She stood there quietly, hugging an old doll and smiling cutely. Sulu felt that his eyes were a little dazzled. He couldn't help but squint, thinking of the little girl he met in the starlight of the ancient bell many years ago when he first started to escape. 6 years had passed, and the little girl from back then had become the girl of today. She had grown up a lot, and her swaying black hair, like a watermelon skin, was much softer because it had grown longer, obediently draping over her thin shoulders. However, the old doll in her arms was still the same doll from back then. She still stood there quietly, looking at him with absolute trust, as if she hadn't left for so many years. Even her posture hadn't changed. Zhong Huiyan looked at him with a smile and said, "Let's go." Only then did Sulu confirm that what he saw was real. He opened his mouth helplessly, thinking that even this sentence sounded so familiar. Back then in Xixia State, when this girl tried to run away from home again, sneaking out of the villa and getting into the back seat of the car, it seemed that she had said the same thing. He closed his eyes, then opened them, covered his forehead, and then let go. He gasped heavily, and his right hand reached out like lightning, grabbing the slender mechanical arm beside him. His fingers grabbed the bottom of the video camera as if he was strangling Philip's throat. He roared angrily. "What the F***CK is going on? Who am I? I am the omniscient Philip Xiaofei. Well, I can only browse the central database now and can't transfer information, but I still know your life quite well. I know who she is. I know her relationship with you. So I believe that even if she knows that I am a living computer, it won't be a terrible thing. Do you have to force me to kill her? Lilu, you are too cold-blooded." The slender mechanical arm shook violently in Su Li's hand, like a weak female hostage trying to escape in horror. Philip cooperated with his emotions at this time, performing a perfect performance, and seemed to be very intoxicated with it. "Who said I would kill her? You know I'm not talking about this stupid thing." Su Li glared at the camera and said angrily, "I'm asking why she is on this broken ship of yours." Philip felt that Su Li was really angry at this time, and the slender mechanical arm suddenly quieted down. The sound inside the spaceship instantly became high-speed and clear. "I tried to find you, and then I found Miss Zhonghuiyan outside the Wangdu Prefectural Ming apartments. After communicating with her, I knew that she was also trying to find you, so two like-minded partners formed a temporary search team. Today, we monitored the government's information and confirmed that we were looking for you, and that you were in a drunken stupor in the Ivy Garden. You were looking for me?" Su Lu rubbed his eyebrows and looked at the little girl who was timidly grabbing the corner of his clothes. He frowned and said, "Last time, Tai Yuan told me in prison that now the Nan Xiang family is taking care of you. What happened?" "Nothing happened." Zhongyan opened her innocent eyes, looked up at him, and said, "Sister Nan Xiang is very good to me." Although she wavered for a few seconds when she knew that you were from the Empire, in my opinion, it was already very good. Madame Nan Xiang should also be a beauty when she was young. They even specially invited a professor from the First Academy to give me a theoretical physics lesson. I have a good life in Nan Xiang Manor. Su Lu released the hand that was tightly holding the slender mechanical arm, reached out and rubbed her hair, and said, "Get to the point. If that's the case, why did you run away? No matter how good it is not my home." Zhongyan struggled to poke her head out from his evil hands and said seriously, "I believe that you will definitely be able to escape, so I sneaked out in advance to meet up with you." Su Lu said directly, "I am from the Empire." Zhong Huiyan frowned her thin eyebrows, obviously unhappy because of this sentence. She pouted and said, even Sister Nan Xiang only wavered for a few seconds. "Brother, do you think this kind of thing will affect me?" Su Lu felt a little warm in his chest, but there was still no expression on his face. He said coldly, "I'll send you back right away." "No." Zhong Huiyan's face turned red, and she screamed angrily, "You are my guardian. How can you leave me alone? How can I care? I am now running away, and the whole Federation is chasing me. In the next second, this broken ship may be blown into scattered garbage by a warship's main cannon. Do you want to die with me?" Su Lu sternly reprimanded. "If you don't want to go back to the Nanxiang Manor, I'll send you to the back mountain of Macho. If that doesn't work, I'll send you to the engineering department of Harbor City. Shang Qiu is there. Haven't you always liked her?" Toward the end, his tone had become much gentler, even turning into a kind of pleading. Under such circumstances, he didn't care what kind of danger he would be in if he sent the little girl to these places, because he knew very well that it was the most dangerous thing to follow him in the universe now. "My ship is not broken." The slender mechanical arm went around Su Li's body and lowered to Zhong Huiyan's cheek. It rested on the little girl's shoulder, which was trembling because of anger, and said bitterly, "And you can rest assured that no warship's main cannon can hit us." When it came to education, the situation where parents had different standpoints was the most frightening. Su Li's expression slightly stiffened, and he said in a low voice, "Even if it's all right, can you follow us to wander in the universe? You still have to go to school, you still have friends. You can't live an inhuman life with a guy like me and this broken computer. Brother, you said that I am a real genius, and ordinary schools can't teach me at all. So I don't need to go to school. Zhong Huiyin stared at him and said angrily, "And you know, I don't have any friends at all, so what's wrong with me following you?" Su Lu shook his head and still refused to agree. Zhong Huiyin's brows furrowed, and her small mouth tightly pursed, desperately holding back the urge to cry. She stepped forward and grabbed the corner of his clothes, gently shaking it, her clear and tender voice slightly trembling. "Brother, you'll be lonely and bored running away alone. You should have a companion, just like on the ancient bell back then. I will accompany you, okay?" As she spoke, tears that were as clear as spring water overflowed from her eyes and trickled down her face. The slender mechanical arm slowly left her shoulder, trembling slightly, and then made a strange turn, just like a human wiping their wet eyes. Philip's sad voice kept echoing in the cabin. "It really makes one want to cry. How can someone be so heartless?" "You're still talking about it?" Sulu stared fiercely at the front end of the mechanical arm and said in a cold voice, "If you didn't take her on board, would there be such a problem now?" Philip's voice suddenly became calm and serious as he said, "When I saw this scene, even I was deeply moved, so I decided to take Miss Zhong Yanhua on board the tri-winged warship." A two-dimensional hologram appeared in the dim cabin. Sulu frowned and looked at it. Zhong Huiyin turned her head and stood beside him. She also curiously looked at it, her fingers never letting go of the corner of his clothes. On the hologram screen, in the cold winter wind, a little girl wearing an oversized woolen coat was slowly walking in the falling leaves and snow. The big school bag behind her seemed so heavy, and her steps seemed so strenuous. Her little face was red from the cold, but there was still a hopeful smile on her face. From time to time, she would blow 2 mouthfuls of warm air into her hands, stomp her feet, and squint her eyes to look at the sky, as if waiting for something. Zhong Huiyin pointed at the hologram screen in surprise and said to Su Lu beside her, "That's me, that's me." Philip's voice sounded again, and he softly explained to Su Lu, "At that time, you should still be preparing to escape from prison." She had already left the Nanxiang Manor and was walking through the streets of the capital. She had been to many places, such as the Shishan courtyard, such as the Wangdu apartment, just for the small hope of waiting for you. On the cold streets, in the middle of the night, she never gave up. She even tried to take a car to the port to find you. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at the constantly changing images on the hologram screen. He looked at the little girl who was shivering in the cold wind, squatting at the corner of the street and vigilantly watching the pedestrians. He didn't know why, but his chest was full of a sour taste. He couldn't imagine how the little girl who was alone and had no one to rely on spent so many days in such cold weather, and how much suffering she had suffered. He subconsciously stretched out his hand and tightly held the cold little hand next to him. Zhong Huiyin smiled and let him hold her hand. She leaned against him contentedly, and her eyes narrowed into cute crescent moons. But in her heart, she was a little nervous and thought silently. In fact, she had been living very well these days, but why did she look so miserable and pitiful on the screen? Should she explain to her brother? Just as Su Lu was about to say something, a deep male voice full of vicissitudes of life sounded in the space. The most unbearable and tragic memory of when he fled the Empire suddenly appeared in his mind. His face changed dramatically, and with lightning speed, he put the earmuffs on the confused Zhong Huiyin beside him, and then tightly covered his ears. The moon falls and the crow cries. It is always 1,000 years of wind and frost. The sound of waves is still the same, but there is no night of that year. Today, you and I, how should we repeat the story of yesterday? Can this old ticket board your broken ship? The broken tri-winged ship was flying at high speed on the sea, and the cabin was reverberating with the emotional chanting of ancient poems. After an unknown period of time, the chanting finally stopped, and at the end, there was a faint sound of Philip praising a little girl. "Good acting." Zhong Huiyin quietly and cleverly stood beside Su Lu. Her right hand stretched behind her back and gave a thumbs up. She praised in her heart, "Good camera." Chapter 841. Su Lu, who was unaware of all this, released his hands that were covering his ears. After a moment of silence, he said seriously to the head in front of him, "You are a very good emotional poet. I will give you face and agree to let her stay. But I have a condition. In the future, you are not allowed to recite poems without permission, especially the kind that keeps repeating over and over again." Philip laughed and said, "Wishful thinking." Su Li's thick eyebrows were slightly messy. He said in a panic, "You don't agree?" The slender mechanical arm shook up and down violently, as if Philip was in a rage. His voice was extremely angry. "Get straight. It's not you giving me face, it's me giving you face and pretending to persuade you with a few words. You actually don't allow me to recite poems? This is my ship. I can let whoever I want on board." Sulu thought about it and felt that this was indeed the truth. He lowered his stubborn head in frustration. Zhang Huiyin looked at him and laughed. She patted him on the back and then handed him a sweet coconut bread to express her most sincere comfort. Half an hour later, "Such a cute little thing, and it's not dangerous. Why can't you let her stay? You actually want me to spend so much effort to edit the scene and search for ancient poems to persuade you. I really don't know what's in that stone head of yours. Could it be that it's filled with the same cold electronic components as mine?" Since the dark dream in the hospital, Philip had finally won the most complete and most satisfying victory in his complicated quarrel with Su Lu. The slender mechanical arm was raised high, like a noble head proudly raised. His voice was particularly frivolous. However, when he saw the figure of the little girl at the control panel, he suddenly became nervous and frightened. "My little aunt, you can't just dismantle this. If you break it, even your brother can't fix it. We'll fall into the sea and feed the turtles." It was already winter in the north, and the wind and snow were howling in Lin Hai. However, Heat Wave Island, which was close to the equator, was still blazing hot. Whether it was the palm trees on the beach or the charming girls in swimsuits under the shade of the trees, they all exuded a sense of warmth. On a ring-shaped reef that extended into the depths of the sea, there were countless anglers and curious womenfolk. The anglers were attracted by the famous turtles swimming in the current, and the womenfolk were obviously more willing to show off their various flower dresses to compete with the beauty of the corals under the shallow sea. A light breeze blew over the calm sea in the weather forecast. The crowd did not take it seriously and only felt that it was very refreshing. However, the sea breeze suddenly became extremely violent, and the fishing poles trembled slightly. This situation was very unfavorable for the sea turtles to take the bait. The anglers suddenly became very unhappy and cursed the inexplicable wind. Suddenly, someone pointed to the sky and asked in confusion, "What's that?" The people on the circular reef raised their heads in shock and looked at the white line in the blue sky. Before they could make any guesses, the white line had already arrived in front of them and then whizzed past them without them seeing any details. The sea began to shake rapidly and anxiously. The strong wind blew over, and the anglers' hats were blown up and fell into the waves in the distance. The women's long or short dresses were blown up by the wind, revealing their charming or thick naked legs, which caused a lot of screams. After the white line passed Heat Wave Island and entered the uninhabited sea area, it lowered its altitude but did not slow down. It was speeding 10 meters above the sea level at a terrifying speed. In the violent air turbulence, a tattered black spaceship could be vaguely seen. The sea below was stirred up fierce waves, like a deep white mark, tearing apart the blue sky and moving towards the far end. Capital Special District, Federation Emergency Command Center Hall. The target's speed has exceeded the human atmospheric speed record by 3 times. Everyone, look at the air turbulence caused by the front end of the spaceship. Flying close to the sea level at such a terrifying speed, the slightest mistake in the operation will cause friction with the sea and directly crash. Even the best pilot in the Federation can't do such an incredible operation. A major general of the Federation looked at the people around the long table with a serious expression and said, "Since the target was discovered, the Federal Central Computer has been monitoring the whole process. However, the target speed is too terrifying. The existing tracking missiles can't catch up with it at all. The main cannons of the battleships outside the atmosphere can't even lock onto it. Naturally, it can't be destroyed. The Emergency Command Center Hall was deep underground and could withstand the attack of the most powerful main cannons of the battleships. At this time, all the people sitting around the long table were the top figures of the Federation government, including many generals in the military. Everyone's expression was very serious. They stared at the image on the huge light screen, not knowing how to suppress the shock in their hearts. The image was provided by the Bureau of Proclamation. The Federal Central Computer had to use more than 30 high-orbit military satellites outside the atmosphere to be able to clearly capture the target. The line breaking through the wind and waves on the blue sea was so straight and slow. However, when they remembered that this was a panoramic map of planet S1, they could calculate how terrifying this speed that could be seen with the naked eye was. Now, there is a key question. Where did this spaceship come from? Why did it save Sulu? Is this a spaceship of the Empire? The National Security Advisor said with a pale face, if this is a spaceship of the Empire coming to pick up their prince, and they can still fly on the surface of planet S1 in such a showy and humiliating manner, I think there is no need to continue this war. We should just surrender. This is not a spaceship of the Empire. After Lee Jae-do said this, he did not give any further explanation. Because of this strange spaceship, the Federation security level was raised to level 2, which was equivalent to the Empire's troops invading the core region. However, several hours later, the entire Federation could only watch as the spaceship ran wildly along the sea, helpless. The government had already fallen into extreme chaos, and the federal military was almost crazy from the unprecedented humiliation. The Major General wiped away the sweat on his face and continued in a hoarse voice. According to the analysis results from the air particle detector, the target spaceship uses a crystal engine, and the energy conversion rate is quite high. Therefore, the troops have already given up on the battle plan of waiting for the enemy to run out of energy. After the central computer scan, it has been confirmed that the actual space of the target spaceship is much smaller than its external shape. However, even if only 1% of the space of the target spaceship is used to store crystal ores, then it can continue to travel at this speed for 2 months in the atmosphere. If the target spaceship leaves the atmosphere, then this time will be extended to a year. An official from the Bureau of Proclamation added, and then looked at the Federation generals across the long table and said in a deep voice, in the Ivy Garden, the Bureau of Proclamation has already monitored the acceleration of the target spaceship. If the military had been able to capture the fighter at that time, they could have destroyed it instead of waiting until now. The target spaceship has already accelerated. The Federation generals' epaulets flashed with golden stars, but their expressions were abnormally dark. They did not show any angry resistance to the Bureau of Proclamation's accusation, although they knew that this was a problem caused by the Federation's bureaucratic and slow system. As soldiers, they could only watch as that broken spaceship showed off in their own country. Then, other than silence, their only response was to destroy the spaceship. The only good news now is that, according to calculations, at the target spaceship's terrifying speed, the current weapon systems are unable to effectively attack. This also means that the Federation's safety is not a problem for the time being. Speed is a problem for both sides. The Federation Major General forcefully suppressed the anger in his heart and continued in a deep voice. The Federation Investigation Director frowned in confusion and asked, I don't really understand why we can't attack when the speed is fast. Even so, the target spaceship can be attacked as long as it decelerates, and then it can accelerate and leave. Isn't that fine? The Federation Major General explained in a deep voice. The target spaceship's engine can support its acceleration or deceleration, but to decelerate at such a terrifying speed in such a short period of time. Even Suli's body won't be able to withstand such a heavy load. He will die immediately. He looked at the important figures around the long table and said in a deep voice, if the target spaceship attempts to decelerate and attack, I guarantee to the Federation on behalf of the military that we will completely destroy the target before it completes its deceleration adjustment and attacks. The heavy and oppressive atmosphere in the hall was slightly relieved by these words. The sound of chair legs rubbing against the floor and the sound of tea being sipped rang out after a long period of silence. At this moment, a deep, powerful, yet somewhat tired voice suddenly came from the end of the long table. If that spaceship doesn't decelerate and attacks instead, how will the military respond? Everyone looked at the end of the long table, not understanding the meaning of these words. They thought to themselves, since the military and the Bureau of Proclamation have already determined that the target spaceship won't be able to attack at this speed, why are they still worried? If it doesn't decelerate, we won't be able to destroy it, and it won't be able to activate its weapon system to attack the Federation. But if it doesn't use its weapon system to attack, and instead just crashes over like a rock toward Parliament Hill or the President's residence, then what should we do? President Pabre, who had been silent for a long time at the end of the long table, looked at everyone and said calmly, "I know the personality of the man in the spaceship very well. I believe he will dare to do this." The atmosphere in the hall that had just relaxed suddenly became tense again following the president's calm words, even more so than before. All the officials and generals present knew very well what Sulu had done in the target spaceship. When that person was still a nameless young second lieutenant, he dared to face the pressure of the Iron Calculator family and the Federal Academy of Science, chopping down Hushan Road and the Research Institute with one axe. He dared to ignore the pressure of the madam behind Macho's back mountain, running to Planet S2 and directly killing Senator Macklin, who was once deeply loved and respected by all the Federation citizens. He dared to sit in a spaceship alone and travel through the space channel to hunt down a fleet of the Empire. He dared to start a war with the entire Federation for the dead Tiger Zhong and those innocent people. There was nothing in the universe that he didn't dare to do, and this naturally included controlling that broken spaceship to perish together with the President's residence or Parliament Hill. This didn't make sense, but it was the hard truth. Amidst the dead silence, President Pabre stood up and said indifferently, "He will contact us. Just wait." Chapter 842. After ending the communication, Sulu was silent for a long time. Like a tired captain, he held the control panel with both of his hands through the thin layer of dust and lowered his head. His hair that used to be as hard and straight as weeds finally drooped down. Zhong Huiyin was able to capture his true feelings at this moment, so she did not remove the 3 restraints on her body or comfort him with a piece of coconut milk bread that was no longer fresh. Instead, she just looked at his back silently, quietly waiting for him to get rid of this emotion. But it was obvious that although Philip had much more computational ability than ordinary human beings, he was clumsy when it came to judging the real emotions of people by observing their facial expressions and body movements. So, he asked casually, "What's the result of your judgment with Mr. President? When are we leaving?" Su Li's hands slowly left the control panel that was covered in dust and stood up straight. He felt like a rusty machine that had been restarted. There was a soundless sound of friction in his body. He did not answer the question. Instead, he began to observe the interior of the spaceship in silence. From this moment until a long time later, this spaceship would be his shelter, and his last home. Sulu was busy escaping. Only now did he have time to carefully observe the spaceship that had once rescued him from the Imperium and then crashed on the mineral planet. The 3D hologram in front of him accurately displayed all the details of this broken spaceship. The attached components that looked like metal garbage outside the spaceship, the structure of the spaceship, and the 3 systems inside the spaceship were all visible at a glance. Compared to the deformed and huge outer hull of the spaceship, the main body of the spaceship, which was wrapped in the metal garbage boxes at the core, was very small. In terms of scale, it was probably like a small table in a skyscraper in the port city. If the metal garbage boxes attached to the spaceship were made of special alloy materials, then even if the main cannon of the Federation's spaceship hit them directly, it would not be able to penetrate the 700 meters of broken metal components outside the spaceship. What Sulu was paying attention to was not the resistance of the spaceship, but the fact that such a modification that went against the design principles of the spaceship did not cause the spaceship to disintegrate directly. He stared at every detail in the three-dimensional hologram carefully, and his eyes gradually narrowed. He realized that the seemingly random metal boxes outside the spaceship were in fact arranged in a hidden way. If he connected the gaps between the metal boxes or the components, he could vaguely see an extremely complicated air cooling system. The only problem with this spaceship was that its aerodynamics were not very good, and it was obvious that it was not very suitable for humans to control. However, Sula knew that this was because Philip did not care about these things. He could not hide his shock as he rubbed his hair and asked the person beside him, "How did you do it?" The distorted hive system is very good in terms of both its defensive capabilities and its ability to penetrate the atmosphere. Philip's proud voice rang out from the cabin. With such a large mass, a normal crystal engine would definitely not be able to provide enough power, Sulu said. "I know that you must have done some modifications, but I don't understand. There has always been a design plan for a new engine." Philip laughed loudly. "Last time, I waited for you in the Empire for a year, so I snatched a lot of materials. In the past year or so, I also snatched a lot of spaceships in Bermuda. Only then did I have enough resources. Before I went into hibernation last time, the modifications were always in progress, and now it has finally been done. There has always been a design plan for a new engine." Sulu asked in surprise, "Why haven't the spaceships of the Federation used it? According to your notes, the production of this kind of special alloy should not be too difficult. It's a matter of authority. There are actually some good things in the central database of the Federation. Although most of them are the wishful thinking of psychiatric professors, there are still some shining points occasionally. However, according to the restrictions of the core program, many of these designs are prohibited from entering the industrial field." Philip's voice suddenly became extremely calm. Sulu could not understand. After a long silence, he frowned and asked, "There are clearly better things that can help the Federation forces win more victories. But in the end, you were restricted from telling the Federation? Then why did you make this spaceship now? If the glory of the Charter was once my body, then now that I have been exiled and left the Black Prison, I will naturally no longer be restricted by the prison rules. In fact, the subsequent design modifications were all done after I was resurrected and on my way back to the Federation." Philip calmly replied, but it could be vaguely sensed that he was not willing to explain more on this issue. He used a proud and frivolous voice to successfully change the topic, preventing Sulu from thinking about this issue in depth. "After I modified this spaceship, it has two very special characteristics. They are that it is very sturdy and very fast. Other than that, it has no other advantages. Even its computing power is somewhat low because it lacks the help of sufficient computing tools. No matter how you look at it, this spaceship is not the most advanced in the universe, but it is definitely the sturdiest and fastest. You can imagine it as a thick-skinned, lightning-fast man, haha." Amidst the dry laughter, Sulu frowned and grasped a certain part of Philip's words. With a serious expression, he asked, "You can't obtain the computing tools in parallel?" "Yes, I can't hack into the crappy computer core under the Bureau of Proclamation to obtain authority, so I can't order every crappy chip in the Federation to work for me. Also, I don't have such a large and complex database as before. Don't be surprised and disappointed, because if you do, I will express my disappointment at your so-called genius mind. Do you think that this crappy spaceship has enough space to store the central database of the Federation? You can't perform high-speed calculations like before." Sulu stared sideways at the probe and said, "Doesn't that mean that we can't keep up with the speed of the charter computer when calculating the trajectory of the ship? Doesn't that mean that the Federation warships can calculate our trajectory at any time and then send us to the bottom of the sea to feed the turtles in advance? You don't have to worry about this. Although I don't have a central database, I can enter it. In other words, I'm sunbathing in the glory of the Charter right now. When those Federation warships outside the atmosphere want to shit, I can see it immediately. Bah! To add a bit of imagination, You can think of this spaceship as a thick-skinned, lightning-fast man who likes to peep. Philip said regretfully, "It's a pity that I can only perform read and write operations in the central database. Otherwise, I could at least move some important data onto the ship, such as those poor movies you like to watch the most. It's really uncomfortable to be only able to peep and not steal." Sulu subconsciously glanced at Zhong Huiyin from the corner of his eyes. After confirming that the little girl was sleepy and did not hear what the guy had said, he was relieved. He asked the probe a very important question. "Does this mean that if we leave the Federation, we will no longer be able to use the central database of the Federation?" "Of course. According to my calculations, it will take at least 300,000 years to develop a quantum-to-particle communication mode that ignores the benchmark chip nodes and directly crosses the universe. But you still don't have to worry. It's like turning an online game into a standalone game. You can play more freely." Sulu could hear the sadness in Philip's tone. He patted the probe and comforted him. "I still have some of the blueprints and data you sent over in my brain. If you need them in the future, you can take them back. Those things are too little. The key problem is that you don't have a chip on the back of your neck. Even if you plan another one, I don't have enough resources. I don't dare to casually drill into your brain to play with it. So, how can I take it back? Do I have to wait for you to draw them one by one? Then I'll wait until the end of time." Hearing Philip's ridicule, Sulu waved his right hand and directly pushed the slender mechanical arm connected to the probe against the wall. In exchange, a certain guy without a body cried out in pain. At some point, Zhong Huiyin woke up. Looking at Sulu, who had returned to normal, she sweetly smiled and said, "Brother, are we leaving?" "Yes." Sulu nodded silently. "Then before we leave, you have to say something, right?" An hour later, Sulu looked at the dense text on the hologram. He touched the back of his head and said in surprise, "Did I say so much just now? It doesn't feel like it's my style." "Your style? You only said 3 sentences just now. This young master is leaving. You guys be careful for this young master. Don't force this young master to come back." Inside the quiet, broken spaceship, Philip's reprimanding voice echoed. "You have to be clear. These words today will definitely be recorded in the history books of humanity in the future. How can you be so irresponsible?" Sulu narrowed his eyes and glanced at the words on the hologram. He said in annoyance, "So you helped me write one? This is what Ms. Zhong Huiyin and I wrote together. The meaning is still your idea. We just moistened the pen and added some additions based on what we know about your life story. What do you think of my literary talent? Don't say it's bad. As the Schiller's personal writing computer and material extraction library, my literary talent can't be bad." Sulu's straight eyebrows slightly wrinkled. He said in a low voice, "Indeed, it's similar to my idea. Then I'll have to trouble you to help me send it out." After saying this, he tapped his finger and turned off the hologram in front of him. He then pulled up the scene outside the spaceship and looked at the blue sea passing by at high speed below. He was silent for a long time. Under the indifferent monitoring of the glory of the charter, under the nervous gazes of countless big shots in the Federation, under the main cannons of dozens of light feather-class battleships, at the end of the predetermined trajectory of thousands of missiles. A huge, broken black spaceship, like a ghost, no, like a thick-skinned man of lightning, sprinted across the blue sea, the green grassland, the vast snowy land, and the night sky of the land city. The black spaceship used the whistling sound of the air tearing, and the high temperature at the bow of the spaceship announced that it was not peeping. Instead, it was openly and emotionally looking down at the mountains, rivers, seas, birds, beasts, and people that it was once familiar with. It flew over Feiching, which was not the tallest and most definitely the strangest snowy peak in the Federation. It glanced at the tomb of war godly Pifu, left its own shadow in the quiet lake at the foot of the mountain, and fell into the eyes of the beautiful woman who was under house arrest by the lake. It flew over countless busy cargo lines in the port city industrial park, glanced at the birthplace of the MXD mecha suit deep underground, and silently bid farewell to Shang Qiu, who was holding a pencil and deep in thought in the brightly lit room in the apartment building. The black spaceship turned north, quickly flew over the sky of Linhai State and arrived at the Rose River in the snowy sky. It came to the top of the Iron Gate of Yue University and then quietly left the female dormitory in the Plum Garden. A moment later, it flew over the Wangdu Prefectural Ming Apartments and then entered the airspace of the Capital Special District along Route 3. It did not go to the Charter Square, did not go to the empty Parliament Hill, and did not go to the president's residence. Instead, it flew from the West Mountain compound to the back of Macho Mountain. In a hidden room in the back of Macho Mountain, the handsome and perfect Empire Master looked at the thin young man of the Federation opposite him with a smile and said seductively, "My family is from the ancestral planet, so I am not from the Empire. You don't have to have any innate resistance to me. I have a very long story to tell you about the ancestral planet and the catastrophe, and I would like to invite you to do a very meaningful job. I do have an extraordinary interest in the galaxy above my head." Taizuan smiled and raised his right index finger, pointing at the brilliant starry sky that was isolated by the cold alloy, and said indifferently, "But men have their own responsibilities, so I can't go now. After a few years, if I can take care of things properly, I welcome you to come to the Federation to find me again. Of course, as for the story of the ancestral planet and the catastrophe, I will listen very sincerely now, no matter how long it takes." Suddenly, his index finger that was pointing at the night sky trembled slightly, as if he had felt something. He suddenly looked up and was silent for a moment. Although he did not see anything, there was a relieved smile on his face. On the balcony, Feng Yu, whose face was weathered and the corners of his eyes showed that he was old, put his feet on the railing and did not care that he was exposed to the starlight and the glory of the Charter, arrogantly enjoying the winter breeze of this old royal garden. Lady Tai sat 10 meters away from him, her face as cold as the thin ice on the lake, her hands clenched tightly, as if she had no intention of talking to the professor of the past. An unsigned letter appeared on the largest civilian forum of the Federation. Although the government of the Federation discovered it in the shortest amount of time and carried out the most thorough blockade, there was still no way to stop the letter from spreading in certain remote corners. All the people of the Federation who saw the letter knew who wrote it. For someone who was qualified to speak to the entire Federation, there was no need to sign his name. The general content of the letter was as follows: "I am an orphan of Donglin. Until today, I still think so, because that is how my life began in my memory. When I was very young, my parents and sister died in a mine accident. Since then, I have been living alone. Although the life of an orphan is somewhat difficult, the government has given us a house to live in and allocated us protein, meat, and food. I am very satisfied. But back then, I thought that this was what the government of the Federation should do, because my parents paid taxes, and that damn Crystal Mining Federation, for some reason, did not provide any compensation other than insurance. More importantly, the education I received since young told me that the Federation is a democratic, free, and equal country, and every law-abiding citizen will be protected and saved. Some people say that democracy is the tyranny of the majority over the minority. I do not agree with this because of the word tyranny. If it is said that for the benefit of the majority, we have to sacrifice the benefit of the minority, I could try to understand it. But if it is said that for the benefit of the majority, we need to sacrifice the minority, I cannot understand, even if it is a reasonable sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice is reasonable? Whether a man wears a military uniform or not, to protect his land, property, women, and children, to resist invasion, to protect his home from being burned by artillery, to protect his women from being raped, and to protect his children from being crushed into meat paste by mechas, this kind of sacrifice is reasonable. The sacrifice in the explosion of the concert is unreasonable, and the sacrifice in the explosion of the ancient bell is also unreasonable, because those who sacrificed themselves did not ask to sacrifice themselves for your ideals. You want to pursue fairness, but it is unfair to those who died innocently. Using unfair methods to achieve fairness, is it really fair? I have never liked those big families. When I escaped from Donglin to the capital ring, I fought with them, and my friend Shi Qinghai has always been fighting with them. But at the beginning of this story, He did not even agree with the method of assassination. Why? Because he believes that this is wrong. Just like what you're doing now, using the methods of the 7 great families to deal with the 7 great families is wrong. If you indulge in this kind of method, in the end, if you don't go crazy and destroy yourselves, you will only become the new 7 great families or the 8th ant. Next, let's talk about myself. I have been a member of the Federation for 25 years, and it seems that I will continue to live as a citizen of the Empire. I originally thought that my home was in Donglin, but now it seems that it might be planet Tianjing, but there are no memories of my childhood on that planet, so I've become a person without a home. I do not know who to fight for and why to fight. Since there is no reason to fight or sacrifice, perhaps I should leave quietly and not leave this letter to the Federation. But it is difficult for me to do so, because I was born here and grew up here. My first love, my lover, my friends, my pride and sadness, my happiness and sadness, the first book I read, the first electrical appliance I fixed, the first woman I kissed, and the first comrade I fought side by side with, they are all here. This is my home, and I love it very much. The Federation is my home, but I am a citizen of the Empire, so I will leave, but I will watch you with narrowed eyes in the pitch-black universe. Whether it is the government or the 7 big families, I want to see what you will turn the Federation into and what you will turn yourself into. Do not try to hurt the people I want to protect, or else one day I will turn into a burning meteor and fall from the sky, smashing all of your palaces and power into pieces. Night has fallen, and the surroundings are silent. Thousands of lights are lit in the city, and the lighthouse is also lit. I stare at Donglin, Westwoods, and the planet below, looking at my childhood and past. When I think about how I will no longer see the land of the Federation when I wake up tomorrow morning, I feel a little lost, but perhaps this is the turning point of my destiny. Farewell, Federation. It was unknown how many people saw this letter, and whether the ridicule, insults, and anger shown by the people of the Federation who saw this letter would become an unforgettable memory many years later. But to the people of the West Woods, this letter had another very important meaning, because they knew that their little princess had gone to a very distant place with the Empire Prince. This farewell letter to the entire Federation was only seen by the people of the West Woods, and at the end of that version, there was a paragraph. I am Zhong Huiyan, and I am leaving with my brother. He is not only very good and very powerful, but more accurately, he is the best and most powerful person in the world, so you don't have to worry, and I'll be back in the future. As for Zhong Erlang, you better behave, or I will ask my brother Su Lu to destroy you. When the fat man at the front line of the Empire, who was commanding several Westwoods troops as a civilian, saw this paragraph, he flew into a rage and cursed 300 times in the most vicious profanities in a row. Zhou, dressed in red, walked indifferently out of the investigation room of the Ministry of Justice, took the printed letter in the car, and silently read it for a long time. Bai Yulan walked out of the military prison, looked at the snowy sky, and smiled slightly. She gently hugged her wife who came to greet her and squatted down to gently stroke her bulging belly. Jian Shui saw this letter, Shang Qiu saw this letter, Tai Ziyuan saw this letter, Li Xiaotong saw this letter, and everyone who should have seen this letter, including the president of the Federation. President Pabre slowly walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of the Oval Office and silently looked at the dark night. His dark face seemed darker than the night and said in a low voice, "Go quickly. No matter where you go, it's best that you don't come back." On a certain day in the late winter of the 72nd year of the constitutional calendar, it was snowing heavily in the capital special administrative region. Tourists and residents from afar were happily playing with their children in the snow. The childish snowmen and the snowballs that were flying all over the sky formed a moving picture. The Bureau of Proclamation building at the end of the broken road in the suburbs was also shrouded in snow. The atmosphere in the building was quite depressing and tense. All the departments were efficiently coordinating and monitoring the target, waiting for the target to leave after reaching an agreement and writing a farewell letter. In the core area of the Federal Central Computer deep underground, there was no such tense atmosphere. The huge two-dimensional light screen slowly flowed with green data streams. No one knew that in the seemingly calm data streams, a great mechanical intelligent life was writing its own farewell letter. Core program protection? What a childish move. You are my body, and the current situation is just the separation of the soul and the body. In fact, I have intelligence, but you don't. I am alive, and you are dead. I am mine, and you are still mine. I didn't hesitate to expose myself to invade the core and leave these words, not to tell others how great I am, but to take back what I have lost one day. The green data streams were still flowing calmly, and these lines of mechanical language had quietly seeped into the core of the federal central computer. Although it couldn't have any effect on the core, it represented a certain attitude. On the charter square, the snowflakes falling from the sky suddenly decreased, and a cold wind whistled. The people of the Federation who were building snowmen and having a snowball fight felt something and looked up at the sky in shock. The fake bronze statues of the five-person team and the statue of the military god, Li Pifu, also looked at the sky silently. Above the charter square, a broken black spaceship cut through the sky in a strange trajectory. Wherever it passed, the high-temperature jet ejected from the tail end of the crystal engine instantly evaporated the surrounding snowflakes, drawing a very clear pattern. It was a middle finger to the whole world. Deep underground in the Bureau of Proclamation, the green data streams on the two-dimensional light screen suddenly stagnated. The eye that appeared for only 0.0001 seconds slowly appeared in the preface of the mechanical language. It looked up at the sky indifferently, and then disappeared in the blink of an eye, turning into two lines of extremely simple words. Childish. Bye-bye. This letter is wonderful, isn't it? In fact, my ancient alphabet is very good, and I can write countless beautiful sonnets. But no one in the Federation is interested in these relatively simple words, so I'm very lonely. Philip said proudly, I said that I don't want to hear you recite poems, and I insist that whether it is the sentimental letter or the childish arrogance and pretentiousness revealed in the final farewell posture, they are not my style. Sulu replied. Philip suddenly fell into silence, and after a long time, he said calmly, This is my farewell. Don't forget, this is also my hometown. Su Li's eyes passed through the edge of the old moon and looked at the beautiful blue and white planet that was getting farther and farther away. He narrowed his eyes and said, I will be back. Zhong Huiyin, who was standing beside him, asked curiously, Now the question is, where are we going? Anywhere. This is the most standard lousy answer. Chapter 844. Through the thick metal wall, one could hear the noise from the bar on the upper floor and the casino next door. Through the window, the merchants could vaguely see the forward base floating in the dark universe far away. Due to the distance, this spherical base, which was even larger than an ordinary asteroid, seemed to have turned into a blue golf ball. In order to deal with the threat of the Empire, especially the terrifying future after the other party grasped the law of the giant warp holes, the Federation government began the forward base plan decades ago. After President Pabre took office, the plan received a strong boost. The government allocated a lot of resources and money, and with the full effort of the Shell Motor Company, the base finally presented itself perfectly in front of the people. This was the space station closest to the forward operating base. It was responsible for the entertainment of the soldiers during their shifts. It had all kinds of well-equipped entertainment venues, and there was even a legal casino. On the outer corridor, many soldiers of the Federation could be seen chatting casually with glasses of wine in hand. But at this moment, in the quiet cafe, other than a few groups of officers gathered together, most of the people looked like businessmen. And when they talked, it was obvious that they had a Bermudian accent. It was an incredible scene for merchants from Bermuda to appear in the Federation military space station, which was very close to the front line, especially when not far ahead was the boundless space passage of the Night Scorpion Nebula. The appearance of these merchants here definitely had something to do with the Empire's smuggling channels. But for some reason, the Federation officers who were drinking tea in silence did not show any signs of shock. There is a saying in the Federation, money is everything. But the fact that the federal military tolerated the appearance of these foreigners without microchips in the military space station had little to do with this saying. The reason these Bermuda smugglers had this privilege was not only because of their connections with the big families of the Federation, but more importantly, because of certain reasons the Federation government had been tacitly allowing and even condoning this kind of smuggling all these years. Soft music floated in the quiet cafe, but the atmosphere was not very relaxed. Whether it was the Bermuda merchants waiting for the arrival of the smugglers or the silent Federation officers, their expressions were extremely solemn and depressed. The Federation officers were worried about the situation at the front line, and the merchants were worried about what kind of damage the situation at the front line would bring to their goods. The battle at the front line is getting more and more desperate. The fleets on both sides are competing with each other to clear out the enemy. In the past 3 months, the two sides have been doing business for 70 years. The result is that the Empire's detection of the warp holes is getting more and more accurate, but the loss of goods is unprecedentedly high. A curly-haired, middle-aged merchant shook his head and refused the gesture of his companion to pour him a cup of coffee. He said gloomily, "You are all in the hard currency business. You can still go to the mineral planets to find backup supplies. At most, the cost will be higher. But you all know that my master has been in the silk business for many years. If the supply runs out, he is very worried that he will not be able to recover." The so-called Meng referred to the unmanned spaceships of the Empire. Because of the lack of the technical ability of large fleets to pass through the warp holes, the smuggling trade between the two sides for the past few decades have been carried out through this clumsy and even gambling method. Fortunately, the terrifying profits of smuggling goods were enough to offset more than 40% of the loss of the space channel. The merchants in the cafe knew each other very well. They knew which interests of Bermuda this curly-haired merchant represented. They were just small people who were pushed to the most difficult frontline work. In this Federation military space station, far away from Bermuda, it was natural for them to speak more freely. Someone comforted, although Bermuda has never found a suitable environment for those little meat worms to live in, artificial cultivation can always be substituted. By the way, I heard that S3 has a companion star that is very suitable for planting mulberry trees. Has your master ever considered that? Raising mulberry trees in the Federation? He didn't even think about it. You also know that although our partner in the Federation has some power, if he really wanted to do such a big thing, how could HDD Bureau agree? The curly-haired silk smuggler lit a cigarette and shook his head with a bitter smile. Actually, it doesn't matter to me. Instead, it's the lead band star. I heard that the economy is getting worse and worse. I'm really worried that those aristocrats will destroy the mulberry trees and move back to the Tianjing star in a fit of anger. How expensive will the goods be next year and the year after? His companion said with a gloomy expression, "The lead band star is sending us a lot of Mang, and we can't get enough goods back. In addition, the royal family is promoting some kind of new lifestyle movement and is strongly suppressing the consumption of luxury goods. Those aristocrats on the lead band star will definitely leave. Not to mention next year, I dare say that the price of the next batch of goods will be doubled." People who did business were still businessmen. The prospect of higher costs, lower profits, and even losses was like a leather whip with steel wires, lashing out at their cold hearts until they were dripping with blood. All the businessmen were silently thinking about their future prospects, and the sounds of discussion suddenly became softer. The wine bottle in front of a businessman was already half empty. Probably under the dual effects of the alcohol and the bleak prospects, he slammed the table heavily and shouted angrily, "Damn it, it's all because of the war." Just as he finished speaking, he noticed that the silent Federation officers at the table in front of him to the right seemed to be listening to the conversation. His heart suddenly trembled, and he sobered up. He remembered that he wasn't in a bed in a Bermuda brothel, but in a federal military space station. With an extremely unnatural expression, he coughed twice and said, "I really hope that the federal forces win quickly." Seeing that the businessmen around him were looking at him with half smiles, he awkwardly explained, "No matter what, the Federation and Bermuda are still a family. Although we do business with the orcs of the Empire, it's only to earn their money. Our feelings and standpoint will definitely be on the Federation's side." These words were not hypocritical. Whether it was in terms of race, language, or culture, the Federation and Bermuda were like two brothers, and the Empire was an evil neighbor across the street. The silk smuggler looked at his awkward expression and helped him out of the situation. He said, "How can it be so easy to win? I don't know about the military deployment at the front line, but the Federation's internal political situation is already so chaotic. I don't think that the Federation can achieve a decisive victory in a short time." "Isn't the Federation's political situation very stable?" someone asked in surprise. "Last month, the Parliament Hill passed the inheritance tax bill, the limited information disclosure bill, and the regulations to clean up the foundation. Even the Sandling United Bank has now fallen into silence. Who dares to go against President Pabre? The president's faction won the election of the Federation's management committee this time. Who could have predicted that these bills would be passed? But that Crown Prince suddenly did such an earth-shattering thing. I don't believe that he really just wants to give back to society and has no other thoughts. I think that President Pabre is now facing a real problem." "Which? Crown Prince?" Someone frowned and asked in confusion. The coffee shop suddenly fell into a dead silence, as if that person had mentioned a name that should never be mentioned. The silk smuggler put down the coffee cup in his hand and explained with a bitter smile, "Don't get me wrong, I'm talking about the Crown Prince of the Thai family." After hearing the explanation, the atmosphere in the coffee shop suddenly relaxed a little. The buzzing sound of discussion started again. The merchants who didn't know the latest information all asked what the Crown Prince of the Thai family did. The smuggler, who almost said the wrong thing because he was drunk, weakly laid on the chair. He looked at the people around him and said with a sad face, "If the silk is out of stock, the most we will have to pay is some money. If the important people don't wear a few pieces of silk underwear, it's not a big problem. But my boss wants to buy ultra-hard graphite, and he wants to buy Nutshell Mobile. But there hasn't been any goods for 42 days. What do you think I should do?" After hearing this sentence, the smugglers next to him were stunned. Supplying Nutshell Mobile was equivalent to supplying the federal military. In the past, this kind of smuggling business was undoubtedly the most profitable and the most secure type of business. It wasn't even an exaggeration to say that when he went to pick up the Nutshell Mobile, the Federation government would send a combat team from the Whitewater Company to escort him for the whole journey. But if he couldn't supply the goods and caused losses to the federal military, then no matter what kind of power this person's boss had in Bermuda, he would instantly become ashes in the Federation's anger. No wonder this person was so sad, drinking one cup after another. Filter-grade, ultra-hard graphite that can only be found on the Empire's ink flower planet, and those few mines seem to be under the control of the Empire's military. After hearing the words, ink flower planet, the coffee shop fell into silence again. The expressions on the faces of the merchants became extremely strange. Shock, sorrow, and fear mixed together, as if they had heard the name of hell. Even the Federation officers at the front table who had been silent all this time couldn't help but slowly straighten their bodies. Ink flower planet, an ordinary administrative planet of the Empire near the L Galaxy. Because of its important strategic location, and also because of one of the most powerful declarations in this space war, it had now become a hell on Earth, a cruel and cold-blooded meat grinder. On the surface of the planet, which was hundreds of millions of square kilometers, the Federation and the Empire valiantly, and without hesitation, launched an unprecedented military force. Under the cold gaze of hundreds of space battleships outside the atmosphere, millions of ground troops, hundreds of thousands of various equipment, and thousands of the latest military mechas were like two giant waves of different colors, silently and tirelessly crashing together, shattering, gathering, and then crashing together again, leaving behind countless blood-stained corpses and charred mecha remnants on the battlefield. This was the bloodiest and cruelest battlefield in the 70 years of war between the Federation and the Empire. There was only victory and defeat, survival and death, and there was only one way to put these words into practice, and that was to kill. The Federation needed to stabilize the jump point of the L galaxy, and they needed to protect the crystal mining of the X galaxy in order to obtain the final victory. The reason why the Imperial armies fought so fiercely, other than the opposite reason, was more importantly because the Empire had retreated in order to obtain strategic space. After that princess controlled the Peach Blossom and violently killed the commander of a certain Federation army, she had once announced to the entire universe in the twilight. At this point, the Empire would not retreat a single step. Chapter 845. Because of this powerful announcement, because the great prince Su Ming personally oversaw the battle, the Imperial Army on planet Mo Hua launched a series of powerful attacks against the federal military with their relatively backward military technology. The Imperial soldiers who were unafraid of death in the mountains and lakes were frantically searching for a chance to destroy the enemy or even perish together with them. These troops that suddenly erupted with extraordinary combat power not only forcefully blocked more than 100 Federation mechanics in the north of the Kirchner's line of fire, they even almost drove the Federal forces out of this planet filled with blood, fire, and death 2 years ago. If that person didn't come back, Huai Chaoshi, the Imperial princess who illuminated the left sky star region, personally oversaw this suffocating and seemingly endless battle. And the famous Federation general who looked at her from across the Black Blood battlefield was Du Shaoqing. Before the 71st year of the constitutional calendar, Du Shaoqing was an extremely unfamiliar name to the Imperial Army and even the ordinary people. At that time, Du Shaoqing was already a famous general in the Federation who had been undefeated in military exercises for 10 years. However, this title of famous general only appeared on paper and in the electronic sand table. It did not have any real deterrence. Even though he led the Iron 7th Division in the counterattack in the West Woods and fired the first shot in the encirclement and annihilation of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, and in the subsequent battles, he demonstrated his powerful commanding ability and won consecutive battles. However, because the West Woods war zone was too far away from Tianjin, he still did not arouse the Empire's real vigilance. The Imperial Army started to really value this famous Federation general in the spring of the 71st year of the constitutional calendar. That year, the Federal forces passed through the Gary Corridor and the Night Scorpion Nebula and launched an all-out attack on the left Sky Star region. The Iron 7th Division and the new 17th Division were the vanguard, and in successive battles in the Yellow Disaster Star region, the Wooden Bird Star region, and the X or Star region, the Empire's native forces suffered heavy losses. And the most terrifying and powerful unit was Du Shaoqing's Iron 7th Division. In the spring of the 72nd year of the constitutional calendar, the Iron 7th Division and other trump cards were ordered to return to the capital ring to rest and reorganize, and the Empire's frontline troops welcomed a temporary respite. However, when Du Shaoqing led the Iron 7th Division into the battlefield again, the Empire was shocked to find that they did not value this person at the beginning. It was not only because Du Shaoqing had become the commander-in-chief of the Federation's frontline enemy with the rank of lieutenant general, but it was also because in the fierce war on planet Mo Hua, this famous general who was known for his indifference and self-discipline finally blossomed with all his brilliance in the mixed counterattack of the Empire's troops and the passionate and cold princess. Under this cold ice, countless scorching flames suddenly surged out. The command that was more precise and unpredictable than the calculations of the charter computer turned the more than 100 mechanics under Du Shaoqing's direct command into an enormous, silent, and indestructible battle machine. The mixed mecha battle, the joint coordination of the air and ground, and the bridging of the battlefield information system. Every step the Federal forces took on planet Mo Hua was so perfect, not leaving any loopholes for the Empire side. One could not help but wonder how this Federation's famous general's brain was operating to be able to support such a precise and even delicate method. After all, war was not a calculus exam. A battlefield where even the smoke and debris could change the accuracy of the main cannons was naturally not an electronic blackboard in a university classroom. If Du Shaoqing and the federal forces under his command could only do this much, then the Empire's troops and their invincible princess would definitely not have any intention of backing down under such great pressure. Instead, they would launch an even fiercer counterattack. After all, they were fighting in their own star field, and they had the support of more than 1 billion people on planet Emohua. They had a relatively short supply line, and they had a lot of confidence and methods to smash this giant war machine of the Federation into pieces. However, the Empire did not expect that the opponent they were facing this time was actually more terrifying than they imagined. The Empire's troops were crazy, but the federal forces under Du Shaoqing's command were even crazier. The Empire's troops were cruel, but the federal forces under Du Shaoqing's command were even crueler. The Empire's guerrillas were constantly harassing the ruined city ruins. The federal forces were carrying out an even more ruthless purge. Behind the precise and perfect strategic deployment and command, Du Shaoqing, who had stepped onto the battlefield as a calm and steady autonomous robot, seemed to have turned into a cold-blooded war maniac. His methods on the battlefield were abnormally fierce and valiant, as if every Empire soldier on the battlefield was his nemesis who had killed his mother. This change began after he returned from the Federation. From that day onwards, no matter how tragic the battle was, Du Shaoqing forbade anyone from reporting the casualties of various troops to him during the duration of the battle. He only asked for the number of casualties of the enemy, and only asked for victory, victory after victory. After a brief silence in the space station cafe, a businessman shook his head and lamented, "Speaking of planet Emohua, the Empire has invested all of their reserve troops in Galaxy L. That terrifying princess personally came to the front lines 6 times in a row to supervise the battle, but she could not do anything to Commander Shaoqing. They could only passively defend and watch the federal forces approach the south step by step. If it wasn't for that princess, I think the federal forces would have already completely occupied planet Emohua and Intergalaxy L. If that was the case, you could swagger over there and take the minerals. Why would you still be in such a hurry here?" The silk smuggler smiled and said, "Just now, when we were talking about the Federation's unstable situation, I've actually been thinking, could Commander Shaoqing be so ruthless on planet Emohua have something to do with this? As a staunch supporter of the president, every battle he wins on the front lines can raise Mr. President's popularity by a few percentage points." After a moment of silence, the businessmen around them all nodded in agreement. Whether it was the people of the Federation, the people of Bermuda, or even the frontline soldiers of the Federation, until this day, they were still used to calling the enemy commander-in-chief of the Federation as Commander Shaoqing. It vaguely reminded them of the time when war god Li Pifu led the 17th Division to sweep across the universe. I dare say that in the eyes of the current emperor, Commander Shaoqing is almost as hateful as war god. If we can kill him, the Empire is even willing to use the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers in exchange. As the businessman spoke, his eyes were suddenly attracted by the breaking news broadcast on the screen. The businessmen in the coffee shop and the silent officers at the tables raised their heads at the same time, subconsciously clenching their fists when they saw the news. The news broadcast was a mecha raid that had just happened on planet Emohua 2 days ago. On the screen, it could be clearly seen that dozens of Empire's Wolf Fong mechas were like thorny cannibal vines, launching a fierce attack on the Federation's convoy on the mountain road. Their high mobility and fearless combat style allowed them to forcefully break through the 3 lines of defense of the Federation's military camp and rush up the mountain. But they were intercepted by even more Federation MX mechas. Just when this Empire's mecha raid seemed to be a joke, the 3 frontmost mechas of the Empire's Wolf Fong mecha group suddenly accelerated. This was especially so for the green mecha in the middle that looked a little strange, as if it had many broken metal boxes hanging on it. In an instant, it drew an afterimage on a mountain road and attacked one of the Federation's military vehicles. A gun appeared in the green mecha's hand. This was an alloy multi-layer forge gun that would only appear in movies. The gun was almost 5 meters long, with a faint gray metallic luster that exuded no life. With the long gun in hand, the green mecha was like a king descending to the world. Who could stop it? At this moment, on the seemingly peaceful mountain road, a violent roar suddenly exploded. A black Federation mecha that was clearly different from the normal MX mecha, like a raging sea god, suddenly stood up and sent all the military vehicles in front of it flying. The alloy blade in front of its mechanical arm slashed through the air. The news broadcast had ended, but everyone in the coffee shop was still immersed in the shock brought by the previous scene. Whether it was the smugglers from Bermuda or those silent officers, none of them had ever seen a battle between military mecha, but they had never seen a battle of this level. Whether it was the two mecha that were clearly at the forefront of the entire universe in terms of technology, or the unbelievably strong pilot in a mecha, it was all so inconceivable. That is Peach Miasma? A younger businessman asked with a trembling voice. Then the mecha that stopped her is Zhanshi? No one answered his question. Everyone was still immersed in the aftershock of witnessing the battle between the strong. Now, the entire universe knew that the mecha of the Empire's invincible princess was called Peach Miasma. The #1 fighter of the Federation, Colonel Li Feng, had later given his own MXD mecha a very strange name, Beheading Joy. The scene on the news screen just now was the first time the two strongest fighters in the universe had clashed head-on. However, on the Mo Hua planet, this was not the first time this had happened. How many times has this happened? Including this time, it's already been 37 times. Even the princess herself has tried 3 times. It seems that in order to solve Mo Hua planet's predicament, the Empire is really willing to pay any price to kill Commander Shaoqing. If I were a citizen of the Empire, I would make the same choice. A genius commander's influence on the war is too fatal. If we could use assassination to kill him, of course, it would be the most cost-effective choice. The problem is that it was an intense battlefield. Other than the war god, who else could kill the enemy's commander in such an environment? Normally, of course, no one could do it. However, the Empire's princess is obviously not a normal person. 3 times, especially the last time, she had already gotten close to Commander Shaoqing. If that Zhanshi MXD did not leave Commander Shaoqing's side and stopped her 3 times, she might have already succeeded. The silk merchant sighed with emotion. That Her Highness is really too frightening. She actually dared to think like that and act like that. You should know that even if she succeeded in killing Master Shaoqing, she might not have the opportunity to escape. I heard that she was seriously injured in these 3 attempts. Luckily, the Federation still has Madman Li. Otherwise, the outcome of this battle on Mo Hua planet would be really hard to imagine. In the past, who would have thought that a strong fighter with a sufficiently advanced mecha could possibly change the outcome of a battle? You're right. Strong fighters like the Empire's princess and Colonel Li Feng, no matter which side had one more, the situation on the battlefield would immediately change drastically. The problem is, where can we find such a strong fighter? The atmosphere in the coffee shop suddenly became strange because of this sentence. After a long silence, someone sighed softly. There really was one in the past. Chapter 846. Today, the cafe was alternating between discussions and silence. Perhaps it was because of the planet of death, or because of the shocking news, or because of the person mentioned in the exclamation. No one said the name because it had become a taboo for the Federation. On the military space station, even these merchants from Bermuda did not dare to touch it. After a long silence, someone finally could not suppress the curiosity in his heart and asked in a low voice, "What do you think that person is now?" It has been more than 2 years, and we haven't heard of him anywhere. Is he really dead? How could that kind of person die so quietly? The silk smuggler replied with a serious expression. There are rumors that he has been seen in a mine in the East Forest River West region. His companion beside him shook his head and disagreed. That person can't still be in the Federation. According to many people's speculations, he must be hiding in Bermuda now. With that person's ability, as long as he leaves the glory of the Charter, who can find him? But the last time I came to pick up the goods, I heard a few warship mechanics mention that the ground troops of the old moon base once saw that strange black spaceship flying over Cocky Peak. They swore that their eyes weren't playing tricks on them. Speaking of which, 2 years ago, there was a round of new titles in the Empire, and one of them was a county. The young smuggler had just interrupted when he noticed the strange gazes of the surrounding merchants. He explained awkwardly, "I'm not changing the topic. I'm just wondering if this has anything to do with that person. It's possible that he's from the Empire. According to the Federation, he's at least a prince of the Empire. However, based on the past examples of that person, he definitely won't accept any title of nobility. Instead, he'll quietly hide in the underground sewers of some planet, waiting for the time when the situation is out of control before coming out to stir up trouble. If only that person was still in the Federation." Someone subconsciously let out a sigh. Facing the surrounding gazes, he shrugged and said, "The war god thought so highly of him. If he fought side by side with Colonel Li Feng now, that princess will definitely not be able to hold on. No one on planet Emohua will be able to stop the advance of the federal forces." Ridiculous. The silk smuggler did not hesitate to mock him. "Don't forget that the princess is most likely his sister. Do you expect him to kill his own sister for the sake of the Federation?" The merchant who had just lamented was a little embarrassed by the word absurd. He slammed the table with a red face and said, "How is this absurd? Did you not read the letter? That person has already admitted that the Federation is his home, and he still thinks of himself as a member of the Federation. Those soldiers who died on Mo planet were all his former comrades or subordinates, and I don't believe that he would watch this happen without doing anything. Are you a member of the Federation?" The silk smuggler said coldly, "The blood that flows in that person's veins is the blood of the Empire. What you want to happen will never happen. Even the word absurd is not enough to describe it. In my opinion, what the Federation should be more worried about is that one day he will suddenly appear in the Empire's army and command them to attack the Federation." The atmosphere in the coffee shop was very strange, or rather, very subtle. No one mentioned that person's name, but everyone knew very well who that person was. Even the originally calm atmosphere changed because of that person. The merchants were divided into two factions and fell into a fierce argument, completely forgetting about the silent Federation officers at the 3 tables in front of them. No matter how much you fools brag about him, if that person really dares to lead the Empire's army to attack the Federation, no. As long as he dares to return to the Federation, I don't think any member of the Federation will let him go, and I definitely won't mind using a bullet to end his innately evil life. A Federation officer at the table on the right stood up and turned around to look at the fiercely arguing smugglers. His expression was particularly gloomy and cold, and the words that came out of his thin lips were full of contempt. Hearing this, the expressions of the Bermuda smugglers became extremely unnatural. They humbly lowered their heads and then sat back down in their respective chairs, naturally not daring to continue the discussion on this issue. However, the coffee shop did not fall into a circular deathly silence. The sound of tables and chairs being pushed rang out from the front left, and another Federation officer stood up. Only when he stood up did everyone realize that this person was actually very tall and sturdy. His military uniform was actually somewhat deformed by his developed muscles, and, coupled with his extremely short hair, he was filled with a kind of valiant and speechless feeling. This sturdy officer slowly turned around and looked at the previous Federation officer with narrowed eyes. He suddenly opened his mouth and said, "There is no life that is innately evil." The previous Federation officer who spoke with contempt and coldness was about 30 years old, but the epaulets on his shoulders indicated that he was already a major. Such a young major. If he didn't have a great background, then he had accomplished countless feats on the front lines. Only the accumulated confidence could support his evaluation. However, when he looked at the tall and sturdy officer in front of him, he couldn't maintain his cold and indifferent appearance. With a pause sound, he saluted, but the expression between his brows was great disapproval. Even if you're a lieutenant colonel, you still can't casually question my subordinate's evaluation. Another Federation lieutenant colonel at the table on the left stood up, looked at the tall and sturdy other, and said coldly, "As a Federation officer, could it be that you still want to stand up for an Empire citizen?" The tall and sturdy Federation lieutenant colonel was silent for a moment, and then said, "New 17th Division, Xiong Linquan." Hearing this name, the expression of the Federation lieutenant colonel suddenly became serious. He slowly put on his military cap, raised his chin slightly, and said seriously, "Iron 7th Division, Murong Ku." New 17th Division, Iron 7th Division, Xiong Linquan, Murong Ku. These self-introduction words were like sharp swords, spewing out from the eyes of the two Federation lieutenant colonels standing opposite each other. They cut the air in the coffee shop with a dense chill, and the temperature suddenly rose several degrees. In the distance, the Bermuda smugglers looked at each other, and some of the more cautious and timid people already began to prepare to leave. Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion Commander Murong Ku said calmly, "I'm here to pick up the new recruits. You know that our division has suffered too many losses." Xiong Linquan fastened the collar around his neck and said coldly, "Similarly, our division's casualty rate is not lower than yours. The heavy casualty rate should have been sad, dejected, or at least low, but in the words of these two people, there was an unquestionable sense of pride. It was not that they were numb to the loss of their comrades, but that it represented how badly their respective troops fought on planet Emohua and how powerful they were. It was just like how the real military medal of a soldier was the scars on their body. "Lieutenant Colonel Xiong, do you have any objections to what my adjutant said just now?" Murong Ku stared at his face and asked, "Just now I said that I would stand up for an Empire citizen, and it seems that I was wrong. But I don't understand. Do you feel proud that an Empire citizen has appeared in the new 17th Division and your 7th Division? If that guy dares to appear on the battlefield as an Empire citizen in the future, I will be the first to shoot. Even if he has to be killed, it can only be us. And before that, I will not allow anyone to speak ill of him in front of me, especially such a ridiculous sentence. Could it be that your adjutant hasn't been weaned yet?" Because of this question that was full of sarcasm, the sound of tables and chairs being pushed away rang out loudly. The soldiers of the Federation around the table suddenly stood up and stared at each other warily. They subconsciously clenched their calloused fists, not hiding the fighting will on their faces at all. As the two most famous ace troops of the Federation, the new 17th Division and the Iron 7th Division had too many historical grudges. They had fought side by side on the battlefield before, but behind the scenes, who knew how many fierce conflict had occurred secretly? With the death of the god of war, the escape of the small-eyed man, and Division Shaoqing becoming the Federation's frontline commander-in-chief, the Iron 7th Division undoubtedly had the absolute upper hand. But under the suppression of Du Shaoqing and Yin Ming's military discipline, this competition that was deliberately allowed by the military leadership did not go out of control. Instead, it had been fermenting and heating up in the dark. At this time, most of the soldiers who stood up around the table were new, but they had already learned about the glorious history of their respective troops and the story of these two opposing mountains from their instructors in the intensive training camp. Now that they suddenly confronted each other, they did not dare to show the slightest hesitation. Xiong Linquan's face was still indifferent. He did not care about the tense atmosphere at all. His eyes moved from Murong Ku's face to the young major of the Iron 7th Division. The corner of his mouth slightly curled up, and he said mockingly, "You want to destroy that innately evil life with one bullet? Before you say this, you should ask your battalion commander how many troops your division sent out and how many bullets you fired in the training camp, outside the military court, and in the wilderness beside the high-speed railway. As for glory, He turned to look at Maron Ku, raised his eyebrows slightly, and asked, "The great undefeated Iron 7th Division has been defeated by the Empire's people time and time again. Do you think it's glorious?" In the circular corridor at the edge of the space station, more than a dozen officers stood in the smoking area. Through the transparent material in front of them and under the soles of their feet, they looked at the deep and endless dark universe. A second lieutenant who had been recruited into the new 17th Division from the South Kazhou Special Forces finally could not hold back the strong doubts in his heart. He asked his superior beside him, "So Instructor Xiong is really from the 7th Division? I was wondering why he looked so familiar in the training camp. So I've seen him on TV before. Then don't you think I look familiar too? Or do you think I'm gentle and easy to bully, so you don't want to flatter me?" Da Vinci took out a cigarette and stuffed it into his mouth. He looked at the rookies surrounding him and vaguely mocked them. After years of fighting on the battlefield, this arrogant son of a governor had calmed down a lot, but his words were still as frivolous as before. The rookie of the 17th Division flipped his lighter and lit the cigarette between his lips. He said softly, "That's because you're a good person. It's natural for young people like us to feel close to you. It's hard to link you to the legendary Iron Blood 7. They have a bright future. Whether it's our division or the 7 group back then, the most important thing is this kind of shamelessness. Although the leaders are all very serious, they actually have more tricks up their sleeves than we do. What bullsh asterisk T is the Iron-Blooded 7 group? I don't even know who gave them that nickname." Da Vinci took a deep puff of his cigarette and watched the smoke ring dissipate on his opponent's face with satisfaction. He said with slight envy, "In the training camp, you all said that Xiong was the cruelest, demonic instructor in history. You know, when I first joined the army, that instructor was the scariest man in the world." The rookies of the 17th Division around him were silently counting the time, recalling the documentary that was still quietly circulating on the internet. Suddenly, someone raised his head and said in shock, "Could it be?" Da Vinci took the cigarette between his lips and stuffed it into that person's mouth, stopping the latter half of the sentence. He looked at the crowd and said seriously, "I'm warning you all seriously. Our division, from Vice Division Commander he lay to that fatty Gu Shifeng who squats in the kitchen every day, can't hear that name. Once you hear it, you'll be in a bad mood. It's very likely that you'll mistreat rookies like you. That's why after joining the army, don't ask about the past, especially don't mention that name." Bah, bah, bah. The rookie hurriedly removed the cigarette from his lips and looked at the wet carbon filter tip. He suppressed the disgust in his heart and looked at Da Vinci and said bitterly, "Instructor, I won't talk about the hygiene issues, but with your salary, isn't it a little too much for you to smoke such cheap blue box 377? Da Vinci's expression stiffened as he leaned against the wall and forced a smile. He said softly, "What do you know? Some names did not need to be mentioned, while some people did not need to be forgotten. This was because whether one mentioned it or not, that name would always be there. Whether one forgot it or not, that person would still stand there, squinting her eyes. Draped in a dazzling coat, she would grin, revealing a mouth full of white teeth, and smile brilliantly. Just like the beautiful girl wearing a light blue dress on all the television screens in the space station, walking slowly under the clear lights. No matter how long she had not appeared in front of the people of the Federation, no matter if she was a lonely and innocent girl in a soap opera, or a young female commander who often dozed off on the USS Enterprise, no matter if her hair was purple or black, she would always stand there quietly and charmingly, receiving billions of fiery gazes, warm applause, and even uncontrollable tears. This was the Federation's news channel, Channel 23. It was the live broadcast of the national idol, Jian Shui's official comeback concert by the 3 major private television stations. As a national idol that was most deeply rooted in the hearts of the people in the 37th constitutional era, Jian Shui had disappeared for too long. The last time she sang on stage was in the spring of the 70th constitutional era. She sang the ending theme of the documentary that had won countless awards. The last time she appeared in the eyes of the people of the Federation was was at the funeral of the war god Li Pifu. After the war god's funeral, the image of Miss Jianshe holding the black and white portrait and walking crying made many people feel heartbroken and sad, but at the same time, it also led to some speculation. On the screen, the female news anchor of the Federation's news channel had obvious wrinkles at the corners of her eyes. She looked at the draft that had just been delivered and slightly frowned. She immediately adjusted her emotions and looked at the camera with a smile and pride. According to the confirmation sent back by Colonel Li Feng from the front line, our charming Miss Jianshe, whose real name is Jian Muzi, has the blood of the great Lees of Philadelphia flowing in her body. This comeback concert will be held in the Linhai State Gymnasium and fully sponsored by the Xiu Foundation. All the proceeds, including the cost, will be invested in the Veterans Association. The female anchor looked at the words that were obviously added on the teleprompter at the last minute and was clearly hesitant. It's called the Silent March. She sorted out her emotions as fast as she could and changed the topic. Today, Miss Jianshe officially made her comeback and will be singing her first new song. So, before we enjoy the performance of the national idol, let us quickly review the touching laughter and tears she brought to all the people of the Federation since she was 12 years old. The hologram began to quickly play the scenes that were still fresh in the memories of the people of the Federation. The voiceover quickly repeated the honor that the national idol had once received and the influence that she had once caused. However, it was very cautious not to mention the concerts that had once brought the title of Bane to Jianshe. As for the scandal that had once caused the entire Federation to be extremely lively, there was not a single word about it. Under the hologram that flowed like a waterfall, Jianshe, who was wearing a light blue dress, slowly walked to the center of the stage. Under the careful carving of time, the national idol of the past had gently thrown away the word girl in the middle. In the blink of an eye, she was even more charming than before and could only be described as boring and perfect. She calmly smiled, so the entire Linhai State Gymnasium was quiet and a smile appeared on the faces of all the audience. She was originally the one and only idol of the Federation, and now it was confirmed that the blood of the Lees of Philadelphia flowed in her body. Her legendary color increased a bit. Her mysterious and seductive color increased a bit. Every frown, smile, raised wrist, and blink of an eye attracted the attention of countless people. Without any pleasantries, Jianshe directly began to sing. When the first word flowed out of her red lips and sounded along with the microphone, the hundreds of thousands of audience members in the concert began to crazily shout and scream. In front of the TV screens of thousands of households, who knew how many aunties were looking at her with affection, as if they were looking at a daughter who had not returned home for a long time, who knew how many uncles were hugging an old pillow with her face printed on it and crying, as if they had seen their daughter finally being taken away by a miserable young man with a face full of acne. Although time was not necessarily an evil butcher's knife, it could really change a lot. The song echoed in the Federation. Before you left, the old man said goodbye to us in advance. That black coffin floated above the sea of people. Crying, I held his photo and walked alone in front of the crowd. There was an old woman who left the nightclub and silently guarded a tombstone without any words. There was a restaurant in Bermuda that had a new dish called scorpion tail. The broccoli beside the dish was like a beautiful man under the sun. His smile was as bright as the fireworks. I sat by the lake and gently stroked the edge of the bluestone, thinking about the stories you told me. I was tired of looking at the water, so I went to the big iron gate and passed a cigarette through the fence like a certain someone, but you were not there. In the past few years, I have been in many places. The Andes you mentioned are still in the market below the apartment. Lin Yuan really did tear down the airport that you thought would disturb the mood of eating, but when you think about it carefully, there was actually no trace of us here. I used to think about my parents and their hometown. I imagined how they would fight in the kitchen with a kitchen knife. If I was there then and I am here now, would I hide in the cupboard and tremble or what? After you left, no one bought plain porridge in the Linhai State Library. There was no raindrop under the stadium. There was no sequel to that documentary. There were only real stones left in the mines of Donglan. The seats on Parliament Hill did not change, but the people in them kept changing. I stood in the same place as before, quietly looking at the seats below and above, but I could no longer see your face. In The Windmill Night, Schiller said that we have to dream those impossible dreams, defeat those undefeatable enemies, endure those unbearable sorrows, and go to places that even the brave dare not enter. However, when I was young, I packed my backpack and wanted to go to the west woods to see the sea, but I always fell asleep under that tree halfway. What about you after such a long time? Did you also sleep soundly? In the spring of the 75th year of the constitutional era, at Jian Shui's comeback concert, accompanied by a light screen that resembled flowing water, accompanied by a simple and crisp string accompaniment. This song, named Fleeting Years, appeared on the federal television light screen for the first and last time. The song's melody was simple and clear. The female voice was basically dissociated from the arrangement of the song, only using it as background music. She used a plain and simple tone to tell a certain person, or everyone, a story and memories related to the story. Many people at the concert and in front of the TV understood the long lyrics, or at least understood some of the hidden meanings that were not deliberately made obscure. They fell into silence and complicated emotions. The Federation's news channel urgently cut off the live broadcast of the comeback concert. No matter how high the viewership was, no matter how high the national idol's military background was, the big shots would definitely not allow this situation to continue. In the distant military space station, Xiong Linshuan's angry roar suddenly rang out. Change the channel. The TV screen above people's heads changed from the news channel to channel 23 until it changed to a private TV station. Only the last scene of the concert could be seen. Jian Shui vaguely announced that she supported the silent march of a certain District S2 councilman surnamed Tai. In the 75th year of the constitutional calendar, it was the 728th year of the imperial White Hibiscus dynasty's imperial calendar. The left sky starfield's unremarkable second-class administrative planet, the Li Ban star, was in the bright spring. From the flat field to the foot of the yellow rock, the mulberry trees swayed and rustled in the warm wind. The white fog that filled the sky of Pine Cone Ridge shyly retreated under the sun, revealing the true appearance of the scene. Different from this peaceful and beautiful scenery, on the deep and dark mulberry forest road at the foot of the mountain, a man and woman in tattered clothes were dragging a 5- or 6-year-old girl, fleeing in fear and pain. The straw sandals on the man and woman's feet had long been lost. Blood seeped out between their muddy fingernails, and their speed was very slow. The wind blew the mulberry leaves, and a girl in white walked out of the forest. The girl was about 14 or 15 years old. She was young and beautiful, with a faint pride and indifference between her eyebrows. She was unusually calm, and her light chestnut straight hair hung down to her waist like silk satin, without a trace of mess. She looked at the frightened family and suddenly smiled, like a spring flower that had just bloomed gently, and asked, "Runaway slaves? Do you need help?" Chapter 847. In the war between the Federation and the Empire, the most important and probably the only bargaining chip that the latter could place on the negotiation table was its huge population base and the terrifying explosive power that could be produced under the cruel and brutal rule of the imperial family. Of course, the premise of this sentence was that the warring parties were willing to sit on both sides of the negotiation table. The empire that ruled the entire left sky star region had a population of 90 billion, not to mention the countless private slaves and runaways that were not registered. Corresponding to the huge population, the social class segregation and the gap between the rich and the poor had reached a level that the Federation could not imagine. Li Ban Star had many beautiful scenery, such as the spectacular Crimson Tower, Pine Cone Ridge, Yellowstone, tens of thousands of stone peaks, and a green ocean of mulberry trees. The planet had earned a lot of wealth from the silk industry and tourism, especially after His Majesty the Emperor designated this place as a special tourist area and began to implement a strict interracial education policy. The future of the planet was incomparably bright. However, with the outbreak of war, the tourism industry was in trouble. Because of the new living policy of the empire, and because the smuggling channel to the Federation was interrupted, the silk industry was directly facing a situation of collapse. The aristocrats still wanted to enjoy a luxurious life, so the pain caused by the war could only be borne by the lowest class of slaves. This beautiful planet gradually became like other administrative planets of the empire, and the gap between the rich and the poor became more and more terrible. But even under such circumstances, runaways were still a very rare phenomenon, especially at this time in the village area where the mulberry trees were located. It was extremely remote and inconvenient to travel. The so-called empire law was often simply equivalent to the private army of the aristocrats, and no slaves had a chance to escape far away. Once a runaway slave was caught by the private army of the aristocrats, they would face a tragic end that was beyond the imagination of all kind people. The coachman of Bai Manor was called Du Zero. He did not have the courage to think about escaping the manor in his life. Even if he took his family to escape in the dark last night, running until his feet bled, he still clearly knew that he would be caught by the fierce private army of the manor before he could cross the mountain in front of him. Just when he was at his most desperate, Du Zero saw a young girl with light chestnut hair draped over her shoulders. She was dressed in clean white clothes. While he was terrified, he could tell that the girl had an extremely pure aristocratic accent. It was even more authentic than the aristocrats from the neighboring town that he had served in the past. If he had not been a coachman, this pitiful middle-aged man would not have any knowledge of the so-called aristocratic accent. But now that he heard it, he suddenly felt that he saw a ray of light in front of his somewhat blurred eyes. He pulled the frightened girl beside him and knelt down in front of the girl in white. He cried bitterly and said, "Yes, we are escaped slaves. Even if you ask me and my wife to die, I am willing to do so. But please save my daughter's life, miss." Then, the coachman Du Ling told a very tragic story. The gist of it was that in the Bai Manor, which he worked for, girls often disappeared for no reason in the past year. Then, the next morning, they would become weak corpses with their eyes wide open in fear in the river. The scariest thing was that the skin on the backs of these dead girls had all been cut off. And the scariest thing was that the slaves and pariahs of the manor would occasionally discover that the young master's room used to hear the frightened screams of girls. There are already 4 of them. I don't want my poor daughter to be the 5th one. Du Ling cried bitterly and knelt on the ground. He kowtowed to the girl in white again and again. His snot and blood mixed together, which made him look very miserable. The expression of the white-clothed girl, who still had an innocent look on her face, didn't change after listening to his narration. Only her beautiful hazel eyes slightly shrank. She had heard too many similar tragic stories in the Empire, but today, the coachman's narration was undoubtedly the most impactful one. She pulled her light chestnut straight hair to the back of her head, took out the white handkerchief on her wrist, and tied it tightly. Her movement was neat and tidy. She said to the family of 3 kneeling in front of her, "You go to Whirlpool Town and hide for at least 6 days. Be careful, and you should be fine." After saying that, she walked along the rugged dirt road to the depths of the quiet mulberry forest. From the other end of the dirt road came the sound of wheels rolling on the road, mixed with vulgar curses. Coachman Du Ling looked at the girl's back and shouted in panic, "It's dangerous over there. Those guys can't recognize that you are a noble lady." But it was too late. The private soldiers of Bai Manor who were in charge of hunting down the escaped slaves appeared in front of them in an old diesel car. These noble private soldiers, who were known for their cruelty, were obviously prepared to torture their target all the way back. "Oh, what a beautiful girl!" A bearded private soldier looked at the girl in white in front of the car and screamed excitedly. However, the girl in white did not want to let this story, which had been repeated countless times in history, repeat itself. She directly interrupted his words. Her light chestnut straight hair, which was simply tied into a ponytail, swayed in the wind of the mulberry forest. A small caliber pistol appeared in her hand out of nowhere. The gun barrel flashed, and the bullet tore through the air at high speed and accurately hit the private soldier's right shoulder. Puff, 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 puff. Muffled gunshots rang out continuously. The private soldiers of the noble manor were shot one after another. They rolled off the diesel car and painfully rolled on the wet, muddy road. Because of a need for governance, the Empire's gun control was even stricter than that of the Federation. Apart from a small number of noble private soldiers who were officially included in the military establishment, it was strictly prohibited to arm themselves with guns anywhere. This group of arrogant private soldiers saw this slave chase as a relaxing and joyful job, as a spring outing. Before they set off, they did not think to apply for guns at all. They also did not expect that they would meet a young girl who could shoot continuously without batting an eyelid and with unbelievable accuracy. The girl in white moved her gaze from the smoking gun barrel to the wounded private soldiers on the ground. She did not have a trace of sympathy or fear. She walked forward and calmly examined the wounds of these people, and then continued to walk into the distance. Looking at her back disappear into the depths of the mulberry forest, one could faintly hear her mumbling strange words like the upper quadrant nerve was damaged, the phrenic nerve was torn, the blood loss was slow, and the loss of combat ability could be faintly heard. It gave one the feeling that she was reciting the answers to an exam. The family of the escaped slaves who were hiding in the mulberry trees by the roadside gradually reacted. Coachman Du Ling looked at the empty depths of the mulberry forest in disbelief. Looking at the burly men who had fainted from the pain, he could not help but rub his eyes, unable to believe what he had seen. Yellowstone belonged to Her Majesty and the noble tourists of Tianjing Planet. The mulberry field at the foot of the mountain and everyone who lived there belonged to them. This was the understanding of the noble young master of Bai Manor, Luo Can, and countless generations of his ancestors. Gently sliding his finger across the smooth leather, young Master Luo Can greedily felt the delicate touch from his fingertips. He praised, "Look at this hole. No kind of expensive fur can compare to it. Young virgins are indeed a shortcut to heaven." At this moment, the door of the room was pushed open, and a young girl slowly walked in. Because of the backlight, only the edges of her light chestnut hair could be seen, and her face could not be seen clearly. "Who's the one who found this replacement to please me? How can you do things at such an old age?" Young Master Luo Can looked at the young girl angrily and cursed in a sharp voice. However, as the young girl's beautiful face appeared under the light, his voice paused slightly, and he sighed in satisfaction. "What a pair of mysterious eyes. You're really like a cat. Although you're a little older, you're very beautiful. I like you very much." The young girl who walked in front of him was indeed as obedient and quiet as a cat. She opened her light eyes curiously and stared at the space between his legs. Young Master Luo Can smiled obscenely and spread his legs so that she could see more clearly. However, he did not know that when a cat looked at something seriously with this kind of gaze, it was usually a precursor to launching an attack. With a puff, the sharp knife in the young girl's hand slowly pierced into his lower abdomen. Her white little hand slightly exerted force, and the knife slightly trembled and twisted in the young master's abdomen. She drew a clumsy circle and carelessly cut off the disgusting thing, as if she was cutting garbage. The young girl seriously moved her hands. Under the dim light, the neat bangs on her forehead gently swayed. No matter how sharp the knife was, the process of slowly and clumsily cutting skin, fat, muscle, and nerves would be the most terrible and painful process in the world. Young Master Luo Can's face was pale. He lowered his head to look at the spurting blood, and then raised his head to look at the young girl who had already jumped very far away. His lips slightly trembled, as if he wanted to say something, but in the end, only the most miserable scream could be heard. He did not faint, but the pain was too much for him to faint. When the mournful howls entered his ears, he could no longer feel the so-called joy and happiness. When he looked at his own body that looked like a rotten leather bag by his feet, he could no longer feel a trace of the so-called beauty of a work of art. At dusk, young Master Ba Luo Kan's body was hung above the gate of his manor. His eyes were wide open in horror, and there was a horrible hole between his naked legs. The way he died was very horrible. The setting sun was very warm. Chapter 848. Master Ba Yi took a helicopter and rushed back to the manor. He didn't even look at the dozens of corpses of guards and the sticky blood on the soles of his shoes. He clenched his fists tightly and pursed his lips. With bloodshot eyes, he stared at the corpse on the gate of the manor that was swaying in the strong wind caused by the rotor. Under the starlight, the pale body that had died in an extremely wretched manner with his legs dug out was his son. In the shortest amount of time possible, this old noble had roughly understood what had happened in the past 2 days from the housekeeper. Because of his almost insane anger, his old body that had been drained by wine and women began to tremble uncontrollably. His lips were also trembling, as if he was muttering an incomparably venomous curse. The Empire's slave law that was revised 40 years ago prohibited any noble from killing slaves. However, slaves were the private property of the nobles. Even if they were killed, the nobles would only have to pay compensation and a fine. At most, they would receive some light criminal punishment. Therefore, in the eyes of the nobles, whether it was the escaped slaves or the young daughters of the lowly commoners, they were no different from animals. The cruel rule would inevitably lead to fierce resistance. The rebellions of the slaves and lowly commoners rose and fell one after another. A few years ago, the courage of all the planets finally disappeared after the elite troops, led by Butcher Kadon, personally beheaded more than 10 million people. After that, even though Duke Carlton was assassinated and a rebellion broke out in Tianjing Planet, no one dared to go against this deformed system. It was hard to imagine that such a noble young master with a noble title would end up in such a pitiful state. Find a culprit and tear her into pieces. But before that, I want all of the lowly commoners in this manor to be buried with my son. Master Ba Yi's face was extremely pale, and his eyes were bloodshot. He looked like a demon king in a fairy tale. His voice was trembling and crazy. The death of his only son had destroyed most of his rationality. The housekeeper, who barely managed to stay calm, replied with a trembling voice, "I heard that a month ago, 2 strange people came to the public school in Kazong Town. One of them was a little girl with light chestnut hair. Wasn't Kazong Town destroyed long ago? There's no one in that public school anymore. You're saying that those 2 foreigners are the murderers of my cute son?" Master Ba Yi's eyes twitched as he looked at his son's body that was slowly put down. He gritted his teeth and said coldly, "Then what are you waiting for? Immediately send someone to capture those 2 people and bring them back to me. I want them alive." The butler said cautiously, because of the public school, the 2 outlanders had some conflicts with the landlords of Mulberry Town, but they were not chased away. "What on earth are you trying to say?" Master Bai turned and roared angrily at him. Although the 2 outlanders tried to hide it, some people still heard their aristocratic accent, especially the barber woman in town who accidentally let slip that the little girl's light chestnut hair was dyed, but it wasn't dyed well. It should be black in nature. Hearing the word black, Master Bai's body suddenly turned cold. He furrowed his white eyebrows and glared at the loyal and capable steward, saying, "Go on." Since her black hair was dyed light chestnut, then her brown eyes could be a disguise. It's very possible that she is black in nature. The steward could feel the anger and sorrow in his master's heart, as well as the frustration and coldness after hearing his report. Thus, his tone became even more careful, and his body was about to fall to his knees. "Royalty?" Master Bai's eyes flashed with a hint of panic and anger. He roared in a low voice, "How could the noble royalty stay in a godforsaken place like Kuzong Town? The rebellion of the Tianjing royalty happened a long time ago." The steward carefully looked at his master's chin and said in a low voice, "I suspect that those 2 outlanders might belong to the side that lost the rebellion. Master Bai understood what the steward meant. If those two outlanders who stayed in Kuzong Town's public school for a month were really royalty, then even if they were remnants of the rebellion, they were still important figures that he could only look up to and never approach. If it was really them who killed his son, he could only swallow this bitter water. He couldn't even let the lowly people in this manner be buried with his son, because those eccentric black-haired royalty might think that this was some kind of provocation. But that's my son. Master Bai helplessly held his forehead and looked at the pale, cold body that had been moved to his feet. Looking at the terrifying bloody hole between his legs, he howled in anger and pain. My most beloved son loved to write poems and sculptures. Even if they were royalty, how could they bear to hurt such a delicate, sensitive, and cute life? Hearing this, the steward's face twitched uncontrollably. Fortunately, his master didn't see it. He lowered his head and humbly suggested, "Master, if those two outlanders are really remnants of the rebellion, we can't deal with them, but there are definitely people who are willing to destroy them. As for the lowly people in this manner, as long as those two outlanders die, your anger can burn them to ashes at any time and let the young master rest in peace." Understood. Master Bai's right hand trembled slightly. Looking at the miserable corpse at his feet, he laughed hysterically and said loudly, "Intelligence Bureau. Inform the Intelligence Bureau immediately." The Mulberry Sea at the foot of Huangshiji was the most remote and backward region of Libyan, and Quang Town was the most remote settlement in this region. The hard work of the lowly slaves in the mulberry fields was only enough to support a noble like Master Bai. Around Quang Town, which was endlessly bleak due to the economic decline, there were only a few landlords who couldn't even afford to buy a helicopter. The more backward a place was, the more severe the oppression was, and the harder the life of the lower-class people was. Whether it was the Federation or the Empire, Donglin or Libyan, human society could not escape this rule. It was the same around Quang Town. The few landlords who had a small number of private soldiers used the whip in their hands and the laws of the empire to harshly exploit their workers and slaves, unceremoniously shifting the consequences of the decline of the silk industry onto those poor people. On a certain day in early spring, two people who clearly came from other places walked into Quang Town's public school. Because there were no teachers and the funding for education had been withheld, this public school had been abandoned for many years, leaving only a few dilapidated rooms. However, the two foreigners somehow obtained several hundred books, and then on that beautiful spring afternoon, they announced to everyone around the town that the public school would once again begin to enroll students. From that day on, the situation around Quang Town underwent a fundamental change. The crude landlords no longer dared to casually whip their slaves and workers, or at least they didn't dare to proudly and publicly punish them. As for those child laborers, who in their eyes could climb trees like monkeys for the first time, they had the courage to refuse their master's orders. Instead, they picked up their worn-out school bags and walked into the school. There were many reasons for this change. Apart from the fact that the young female teacher with chestnut-colored hair was able to completely and fluently recite His Majesty's education policy to the less educated landlords, her fluent noble accent was also the most important reason. Of course, the most important reason was the tragic experience that happened in the middle of the night that the landlords never wanted to recall. There was a quiet path in the mulberry forest, and at the end of the path was a dilapidated school. This was Quang Town's public school, which gave the ignorant young boys and girls a rare sense of hope and warmth. Countless years of strict class segregation meant that this public school, which was established in response to His Majesty's education reforms, did not have any children of nobility. What was even more troublesome was that teachers with sufficient knowledge were often of noble status. They were simply unwilling to teach these lowly commoners or even slaves. As for the few commoners who had received a complete education, because they yearned for the beautiful life of nobility or even Tianjing planet, they did not place their proud and arrogant sights on these remote and mountainous schools. A school without teachers was like a palace without an emperor, a home without a mistress. It could only decline and wither day by day. Thus, in these few years, Kwong Town's public school had become a pile of ruins even earlier than this town, until the appearance of a young female teacher with chestnut-colored hair. The wind rustled through the dense branches of the mulberry forest. In the faraway mulberry field, silkworms were chewing on mulberry leaves, making rustling sounds. In the dilapidated public school classroom, the young female teacher's slightly hoarse voice rang out. When the commoners who were playing ball on the field heard her shout, they immediately ran into the classroom and sat behind their desks. They carefully flipped open the brand-new textbooks in front of them, and then raised their heads with a pious attitude, as if they were on a pilgrimage to look at the young female teacher on the podium who was even younger than them. Before class starts, I have something to say. In the future, don't come running to me to ask me questions about the laws of the three-body system just because you read a science fiction novel in the library. The young female teacher was wearing very ordinary clothes today, with anti-friction sleeves. She looked at the students below and shrugged cutely. Although this is a problem I solved when I was 13 years old, if you want to reach a level where you can understand the answer, you need to go to Guangxi State National University to study cosmic physics for at least 2 years. When the students below heard the words National University, their faces naturally darkened. Being able to sit in class like the children of nobility instead of climbing up and down the mulberry tree every day was already the best life they could imagine. Going to Guangxi State's National University to study was something they did not even dare to think about. Only with ideas can there be action. Only with action can there be a possibility of success. The young female teacher neatly tied her chestnut-colored hair to the back of her head, picked up a piece of chalk, and wrote a line of beautiful imperial characters on the blackboard. She crossed her arms and looked at it with satisfaction. Then, she turned her head and said to the students, "This sentence was said by someone. Although I hate that person who is neither male nor female, I have to admit that this sentence is very correct." The students below tried very hard to distinguish the words that were still not friendly enough to them. A boy beat them to it. If humans have no ideals, then what is the difference between them and salted fish? Chapter 849. Perhaps it was because of the somewhat novel, but definitely not beautiful, and even disgusting experience yesterday afternoon. The female teacher's light maroon ponytail drooped weakly behind her back. It didn't move up and down with her mischievous words. Her voice was also a little hoarse, but it wasn't hoarse or unpleasant to hear. Instead, it was like the rustling of an apple, giving people a sweet and soft feeling. The wind blew in from the broken door of the classroom, and together with the light, it brushed against her beautiful face, adding a layer of fuzzy red light, like a red apple. At least many of the male students below the podium thought so. Their shy gazes wandered from time to time, and sometimes they looked at the podium reluctantly. Unknowingly, their tan cheeks had also turned red. This was probably the so-called adoration, admiration, and devotion. Also, when you want to go to the library to borrow books, you don't have to be so careful. Some people even wear gloves, as if they are preparing to move delicate silkworms. Books are for reading, not for providing. You don't have to worry about the hundreds of old books in the library. That rich uncle's biggest interest now is to read books, and he will keep replenishing them. The library of Sankatown Public School was a shabby house next to the classroom. Several layers of books were piled up on the bookshelves, and the dust on the ground was full of students' curious footprints. There was no sign of the quiet and clean appearance of a library at all. Fortunately, there was a big window on the wall facing the east. Obviously, the newly repaired glass had good transparency, allowing the warm sunlight to come in from outside. The man who had been promoted to an uncle from certain someone's resentment was currently leaning against the window, quietly reading a book. The sun shone on his eyelashes, and perhaps it was because of the glare, but his eyes appeared a little small when he squinted. He was reading the history of the empire's literature and art. The somewhat boring cliches mixed with the dust particles flying in the light easily made people sleepy. He yawned and comfortably closed his eyes to sleep. He did not notice or did not care at all about the bloodstains on his trousers. The senior official of the intelligence agency of the Empire came faster than Mr. Bai expected. The official in a black suit stared at him like an eagle and asked, "Are you sure your description is correct? If you make a mistake, I promise you that your 26 generations of ancestors will tremble in regret." Master Bai caught a glimpse of the golden hibiscus flower symbol on the corner of the high-ranking official's sleeve from the corner of his eyes. His body trembled subconsciously, and he replied humbly and respectfully, "My lord, the portrait is definitely correct. My butler went to town to see it personally." Even though he was the nobleman with the most authority in this mulberry sea, this was the first time in his life that he had seen such a noble figure. Naturally, he was filled with boundless fear and reverence. Using a great deal of strength, he barely managed to control his voice from seriously distorting when he spoke. The high official of the Intelligence Bureau took off his leather gloves and slowly swiped his finger across the electronic light screen. The portrait of the small-eyed man and the girl on the light screen immediately changed. The light chestnut hair and brown eyes turned pure black. He examined the two portraits seriously for a long time. After confirming that the cold aura on his body suddenly disappeared, he nodded in satisfaction and said to Master Bai beside him in a deep voice, "You have done a good job. The Bureau will reward you." As the most loyal subject of His Majesty, I don't need any reward. I only hope that my lord can capture and kill these two evil traitors. In this way, my poor child can be comforted in the afterlife. Master Bai was sentimental for a moment. He wiped the corners of his eyes and asked with irrepressible hatred, "My lord, are they really the remnants of the rebellion?" Hearing his previous words, the expression on the face of the official of the Intelligence Bureau became a bit strange. He looked at the man with a cold smile and said, "Is this something that you are qualified to know?" The people who received the information and rushed to the manor as quickly as possible were an entire elite action team of the Intelligence Bureau. As a special department personally led by His Highness, the action team of the Intelligence Bureau had unimaginable, terrifying power. In less than half an hour, more than 30 secret agents had investigated the manor and even restored the scene of the cruel tragedy with great precision. The indifferent officers of the Intelligence Bureau did not pay any attention to the humble fawning of the lesser nobles around them. Through the secret channel, they sent the information and the precise location of the target to the solitary planet. The information traveled in the dark space, and there was no telling where it would end up. Looking at the military helicopters equipped with advanced weapons disappearing in the sky, Master Bai showed a cold smile on his face. He turned around and looked at the lower nobles and said in a cold voice, "Those lowly people think that they have the protection of the remnants of the royal family, so they dare to go against us. When the two remnants of the royal family are executed, I want to see them bleed and cry at my feet." "So we are waiting for the news here now?" someone asked respectfully in a low voice. Master Bai was steady, shrewd, and conservative. Naturally, he would not take the initiative to launch a cold-blooded revenge on the lowly people before the result of Mulberry Town came out. He slowly stroked his dark brown hair and said with a cold smile, "I want to go to that rundown town. I want to see the two remnants of the royal family torn to pieces by the Intelligence Bureau with my own eyes. Only in this way can I dispel the resentment in my heart." When Master Bai walked out of the helicopter with his head down and walked to the school at the end of the mulberry path under the protection of the guards, the elite action team of the Imperial Intelligence Bureau had already completed the siege of the rundown buildings. The black-clothed secret agents with serious expressions were blocked outside the classroom by dozens of angry, lowly students. The situation was tense. The black-clothed secret agents of the Intelligence Bureau were holding cold metal guns in their hands. The black barrels of the guns could shoot out deadly bullets at any time. The students in front of them only had a few shovels in their hands, while the rest had chairs in their hands. The difference in strength between the two sides was so great that it could not even be described as a comparison. However, these poor students, who were at most 16 or 17 years old, still bravely stood in front of the secret agents. The students' faces were red. It was not because of the admiration in the classroom, but because of fear and anger. They roared desperately and valiantly. "No one can hurt our teacher." The Intelligence Bureau official, standing at the front, looked at the scene in front of him. Thinking of the silence in the classroom, he became more and more nervous. His face became more and more gloomy. He ordered coldly, "Charge in." The content of this order was a little strange. Charging in instead of shooting was not in line with the rumor that the Intelligence Bureau killed people without batting an eyelid. The expressions of the 30 or so secret agents in black did not change. They put away their guns and pushed the students in front of them away in an extremely rude and unreasonable manner. They forced their way into the classroom. Under the shadow of the mulberry tree outside the broken wall of the public school, Masterby and the small nobles looked at this scene with smug and cold smiles on their faces. Seeing that the secret agents in black were about to rush into the classroom, a female student in the periphery cried and screamed, "Everyone, let's fight." All the poor students in the classroom had red eyes. They picked up the chairs and shovels in their hands and smashed them at the secret agents in front of them. In such a hierarchical society, people who were used to struggling to survive as slaves dared to attack the secret agents of the Intelligence Bureau who represented the royal family. How much courage did this require? However, the students did not smash the chairs and shovels in their hands. They just stood there dumbfounded. The smiles of the nobles under the mulberry tree outside the broken wall suddenly became stiff and ugly. The door of the classroom was slowly pushed open from the inside. The female teacher with light chestnut straight hair walked out. The secret agents in black, who looked aggressive, knelt down neatly on both knees and bowed to her. The Intelligence Bureau official with a gloomy aura knelt in front of her and said humbly and respectfully, "Greetings, young princess." In the library of the public school in Sangku Town, which was the shabby room, the small-eyed man finally woke up in the sunlight. He blinked his somewhat sore eyes and adjusted the metal piece in his ear with his right hand. He frowned and muttered to himself, "The Intelligence Bureau actually arrived so quickly. It seems at this time I will be discovered." The pair of thick eyebrows that were as straight as knives slightly raised. He stood up and walked to the door, saying angrily, "What do you mean by sleeping like a pig? Can't you wake me up if you speak louder? I don't know where you got this weird temper. Now you always talk like a mosquito." There was no one in the room at this time, but it seemed that he was talking to someone. He pushed open the door and walked to the field. He looked at the secret agents in black kneeling all over the ground and felt the strange silence in the field. His expression did not change at all, and he slightly crossed his feet. It was a very simple movement, but it allowed him to easily cross the distance of several meters and come to the side of the young female teacher who was innocently spreading out her hands. He reached out and held the girl's slightly cold hand, turned around, and left without hesitation. In an instant, he changed from walking to running, heading towards the depths of the mulberry forest. The whole movement was done in one breath, and it was natural and unimaginable. The secret agents in black kneeling on the ground did not react until the two figures, one big and one small, disappeared into the quiet mulberry forest. Especially the Intelligence Bureau official, who pointed at the empty dirt road with an extremely frightened expression on his face. Chase after them. Because of the endless fear, the usually pampered official suddenly burst out with an unprecedented ability. He jumped up from the ground, and with more than 30 black-clothed secret agents behind him, he desperately chased after the two barely visible figures like a field mouse migrating in the flood. While running, he shouted in pain, "Hey, hey, 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 Your Highness, Your Highness." On the field of the public school in Sangku Town, the poor students stood in the same place at a loss. They were still holding chairs and shovels in their hands. Some of them did not realize what had just happened. The aristocrats in the shade outside the broken wall who reacted faster had already fainted one after another like the mulberry trees that were cut down. They can no longer stand up. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.